My name is Daniel Reyes. I'm 38 years old. This happened last fall, deep in the rugged expanse of the Organ Mountains Desert Peaks National Monument near Las Cruces, New Mexico. A trip that began with the promise of adventure and ended in a nightmare I still struggle to recall in full. I'd planned the RV camping trip with 3 close companions: Maria Mia Alvarez, whose military-honed instincts and unwavering pragmatism kept us grounded; Jason Miller, a charismatic friend with secrets hidden behind a charming smile; and Becky Turner, a bright-eyed college student whose enthusiasm for the unknown made her the heart of our group. We craved an escape from our mundane routines, lured by legends of ancient indigenous lore and whispered tales of cursed trails in this remote corner of New Mexico. Our journey began with high hopes and a hint of trepidation. The RV, a sturdy vehicle in most respects, began sputtering ominously just as we set off. I dismissed it as a minor hiccup, nothing that couldn't be fixed later, but in retrospect it was the first warning that our expedition might be plagued by more than just mechanical troubles. We drove along winding mountain roads until we reached a narrow pass cradled by the towering, rugged peaks of the Organ Mountains. The landscape was mesmerizing, the red and brown hues of the rocks contrasting starkly with the deep blue sky. As we set up camp, I couldn't help but notice strange symbols crudely carved into the bark of ancient pines lining the trail. They looked almost ritualistic, patterns that hinted at a history older and darker than any of us could imagine. Night fell quickly. The RV's interior, normally a haven of warmth and camaraderie, turned into a claustrophobic cell as our devices began to malfunction. Communication lines went dead, and our only source of light flickered ominously. Outside, the howling wind carried eerie, unplaceable sounds, and the distant rumble of what could have been thunder, or something else, echoed off the rocky slopes. I remember sitting by the dying embers of our campfire, exchanging uneasy glances with Mia. She insisted there had to be a rational explanation. A fault in our equipment, perhaps some local wildlife making noise in the night. But as I listened, my skin prickled with the feeling of being watched. Somewhere in the darkness, I felt the unmistakable presence of something not quite human. The following day brought more unsettling discoveries. While scouting the perimeter of our campsite, I stumbled across a series of tire tracks far too deep into the backwoods for any legitimate vehicle. The tracks were erratic, as if someone, or something, had abandoned a car in haste. Along with them, I found more of those ancient symbols etched into stone near a small dried-up creek. They resonated with a foreboding energy that made my heart pound. Our group's initial excitement had begun to erode under the weight of mounting tensions. The RV's persistent mechanical issues forced us to ration supplies and even reconsider our planned route. During one heated discussion, Jason's vague, almost dismissive attitude toward the local legends set off alarms in me. His eyes darted nervously whenever the topic of indigenous cults or recent human trafficking cases in the area came up. It was as though he knew more than he was letting on, a secret that gnawed at the edge of my conscience. Then, one fateful night, everything unraveled. We were gathered around a makeshift table inside the RV when distant shouts echoed through the silent night. The door burst open, and before we could react, masked figures swarmed the RV. In the chaos, I caught a glimpse of Jason exchanging furtive nods with one of these strangers, members of a local cult whose reputation for human trafficking and unspeakable rituals had begun to surface in whispered rumors among locals. My stomach churned as I realized that our group had become entangled in something far more sinister than I could have ever anticipated. Amid the ensuing struggle, Becky was forcibly dragged from the RV. I remember her pleading, her wide eyes brimming with terror as she was pulled away by grim-faced cult members. The attackers wore expressions that were devoid of mercy, and I could barely comprehend the horror unfolding before me. As they disappeared into the darkened landscape, a sound, an otherworldly, bone-chilling howl, cut through the night. It was then that I first saw it, a towering, shifting figure emerging from the shadows, a creature they whispered about in local legend, known as the Skinwalker, or El Camaleón Oscuro. The creature was a grotesque parody of life, its form fluid and disjointed. At one moment it resembled a human cloaked in tattered garments. The next, its features contorted into a nightmarish amalgamation of beast and man. Its eyes glowed with a predatory intelligence as it helped the cult members haul Becky away, its presence sealing the fate of our little group. Mia and I managed to retreat into the unforgiving wilderness, our hearts pounding in a mixture of adrenaline and dread. The RV, our temporary sanctuary, now felt like a death trap abandoned to fate. We knew we had to act. Our only hope was to rescue Becky, who now faced the dual horror of human cruelty and supernatural malevolence. Driven by desperation, Mia and I began piecing together clues from the scant evidence left behind. The bizarre symbols, the strange tire tracks, and even cryptic whispers from a local we encountered before the ambush, who hinted at an abandoned mine near an ancient indigenous site. That mine, long forgotten by most, was rumored to be a gathering place for the cult's dark rituals. Every step towards that mine was fraught with peril. The terrain was treacherous. Rocky paths and sudden drops made every movement a calculated risk. As we traversed narrow trails, the oppressive atmosphere of the mountains weighed heavily upon us. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed. Shadows shifted in the periphery of my vision, and every rustle of the wind carried an undercurrent of menace. Mia's resolve never wavered. "We can't leave Becky to that fate," she said firmly as we navigated a particularly steep incline. "We're not just fighting cultists, we're fighting something older, something that thrives on our fear." I could see the fire in her eyes, a determination that outmatched even my own trembling apprehension. When we finally reached the dilapidated mine entrance, the air was heavy with a mixture of damp earth and decay. The mine's interior was a labyrinth of narrow tunnels and cavernous chambers, where the echoes of our footsteps mingled with the distant, muffled sounds of a ritual in progress. Flickering torches revealed crude symbols and disturbing images painted on the walls, each one a grim testament to the horrors that had taken root here. Inside one of the larger chambers we found Becky, but the sight that greeted us was one of utter devastation. Becky was bound to a stone altar, her face streaked with tears and dirt, her body bearing signs of brutal torture. The cult members encircled her, their chants rising in a dissonant cadence that sent shivers down my spine. At the center of the ritual stood the Skinwalker, its form shifting in the half-light, its eyes locked onto us with an intensity that made the very air seem to vibrate with malice. Before Mia or I could act, the creature's howl reverberated through the cavern, and chaos erupted. I fired my handgun, our last remaining defense, and the sound of the shot mingled with screams and the cult's enraged shouts. In the ensuing melee, I saw Jason, the traitor, attempting to escape amid the confusion. His betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound. It was a final, irrevocable breach of trust. Mia fought with the precision of someone who had faced far worse. We battled our way through the cultists, each moment a blur of violent clashes, desperate maneuvers, and the ever-present specter of that monstrous Skinwalker. I can still recall the terror in my heart as I watched one of the cultists seize Becky and drag her deeper into the maze of tunnels, her cries echoing off stone walls. In a final, desperate effort, Mia and I cornered the cult leader in a narrow passage. The confrontation was brutal and swift, an explosion of violence that ended with the cult leader's lifeless body collapsing to the ground. Yet, even as we triumphed over this human horror, our victory was bittersweet. The skinwalker lurked in the shadows, its presence a stark reminder that our battle was far from over. The aftermath was a haze of pain and loss. Jason's betrayal had not only cost us our trust, but had unleashed an enemy that left us scarred both physically and emotionally. Although we managed to rescue Becky from the immediate clutches of the cult, the ordeal had left her broken. Her recovery was uncertain, and the darkness that had touched her soul threatened to linger long after we returned to civilization. I often lie awake at night, haunted by the memories of that rainy, blood-soaked night in the mine. The taste of fear, the sound of desperate screams, and the chilling gaze of the skinwalker are etched into my mind. Mia and I eventually made it out of the Organ Mountains, our bonds forever altered by the horrors we endured. We shared a silent understanding, a grim acceptance that some truths are too terrible to forget, that isolation in the wild can bring out the darkest parts of human nature and awaken ancient evils lurking beneath the surface of reality. I sometimes wonder if the legends were mere folklore, or if our encounter was the inevitable collision of modern cruelty and the supernatural forces of an ancient land. One thing is certain: the mountains still hold their secrets, and every rustle in the wind or unexpected shadow serves as a reminder of that night. The betrayal of a friend, the agony of watching a loved one suffer, and the unyielding presence of a creature beyond comprehension have left indelible marks on my soul. Now, as I sit alone in a modest apartment far from those haunted peaks, I find no solace in the familiar. Instead, I feel the constant, creeping dread that the world is full of hidden darkness. Sometimes, in the silence of the night, I hear a distant, unearthly howl, a sound that makes me question whether the nightmare I escaped truly ended, or if it's merely waiting for the next traveler to wander too deep into the shadows of the Organ Mountains. My name is Jack Carter. I'm 45. This happened in the barren, haunting expanses of El Malpais National Monument, out in western New Mexico. I was escaping the ghosts of my past, a bitter divorce, a career that had crumbled beneath the weight of my own regrets, and I thought solitude in the desert might offer me some clarity. I rented an old RV that rattled and groaned with every mile, its unreliable electrical system and temperamental heater a constant reminder that nothing in life ever worked perfectly. Driving down endless, empty roads, I felt the sting of isolation sharpen with every passing mile. The RV's radio crackled to life unexpectedly, spitting out garbled voices and a mournful melody that seemed to plead for help. I brushed it off as a faulty circuit, just another imperfection in this aging vehicle, but a deep, nagging unease began to settle in. When I finally arrived at a remote spot near ancient lava flows and weathered petroglyphs, the desert stretched out before me like a vast canvas of solitude. I parked near a cluster of weathered rock formations, their surfaces etched with stories I could no longer ignore. The air was heavy, the temperature oscillating brutally between scorching heat during the day and an almost bone-chilling cold at night. With no cell service and only an outdated map to guide me, I felt both free and profoundly alone. It wasn't long before odd things began to happen. Late one evening, while I was rummaging through the cluttered interior of the RV, I discovered an old photograph tucked between the pages of a magazine. A faded image of a young woman whose sorrowful eyes and gentle smile struck an inexplicable chord in me. Beneath it lay a folded letter, its handwriting curving in familiar yet long-forgotten loops. My heart pounded as memories of a past misstep I'd desperately tried to bury came flooding back. Had someone been here before, Or was it my own guilt manifesting in the most uncanny way? That same night, as twilight bled into darkness, I noticed footprints surrounding my makeshift campsite. They were shallow, almost as if made by someone, or something, seeking not to leave a mark but to mimic the patterns etched in the nearby petroglyphs. I tried to rationalize it as the result of shifting sand, but deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. A few days into my solitary retreat, I encountered Rosa Delgado, a local woman with a quiet, enigmatic air. She seemed to know the land as intimately as its own heartbeat, and offered me cryptic warnings about the spirits that roamed these ancient grounds. "There's a presence here, Senor Carter," she told me softly, her eyes dark with sorrow. "They call her La Dama del Desierto, the Lady of the Desert. Some say she is the spirit of a young woman who met a tragic end near those petroglyphs. Others believe she's drawn to those who carry guilt." Her words unsettled me more than I cared to admit, dredging up feelings of responsibility and regret for mistakes long past. I also had a brief encounter with Eli, a gruff park ranger who patrolled these remote areas. He told me in a clipped tone that the stories of La Dama were as old as the rocks themselves. "People see things out here that can't be explained," he grunted. "Sometimes it's the wind. Other times it's something else." His hardened exterior couldn't entirely mask a hint of superstition, and his words only added to my mounting anxiety. At night, the desert revealed its true nature. The RV's lights flickered erratically, and during a particularly fierce sandstorm, the power surged and then died, plunging me into an oppressive darkness. I sat huddled on a threadbare blanket, the howling wind carrying with it not just sand but what sounded like desperate whispers. I couldn't tell if the voices were borne by the wind or rising from within me. Every gust of wind, every shadow that shifted across the cracked earth made my heart race. I began to have vivid dreams, nightmares, where I relived the moment of a decision that had haunted me for years. I had been involved, indirectly, in a situation where an innocent life was lost. I'd always blamed myself, even though I'd tried to justify it as a necessary sacrifice. Now, in these dreams, the face of the young woman from the photograph appeared over and over, her eyes full of silent accusation. I woke up drenched in sweat, the desert night offering no solace. Then, on a night when the wind's howl reached a fever pitch, the final confrontation began. An electrical surge jolted the RV, and in that moment of chaos, I was forced to abandon the relative safety of the vehicle. Clutching a flashlight and nothing more than a deep, gnawing need to understand what was happening, I stepped out into the storm. The sand whipped at my face, and I fought against the blinding gusts as I made my way toward a narrow, hidden trail leading to a canyon lined with ancient petroglyphs. The trail seemed to beckon me, as if the very earth was urging me to confront the source of my torment. Every step was a struggle, against the storm, against the inner turmoil that threatened to overwhelm me. As I descended into the canyon, the sounds of the raging sandstorm faded into a surreal hush. The walls of the canyon, carved and scarred by time, glowed dimly in the pale light of my failing flashlight. And then I saw her. La Dama del Desierto appeared at the far end of the canyon, illuminated by a shaft of light that broke through the storm. She was ethereal, her form draped in a flowing white dress that billowed as if caught in an unseen breeze. Her eyes, filled with sorrow and unspoken pain, met mine. For a moment, time seemed to stand still as I stared into the depths of her gaze, and I knew that she was not merely a ghost, but a manifestation of all the guilt and regret that I had been carrying. Her presence was overwhelming, and suddenly the whispers of the wind became words. a lamentation of loss and a plea for redemption. I was forced to relive that long-buried mistake, the one moment when I had chosen self-preservation over responsibility. The weight of my guilt, long suppressed, surged through me as if I were drowning in memories of blood and tears. I fell to my knees on the cold, rough ground, tears streaming down my face as the storm raged around me. In that heart-wrenching moment, La Dama seemed to reach out to me. I don't know if it was her hand or a gust of wind, but I felt a touch, a cold, insistent caress that urged me to remember, to acknowledge, and to atone. I whispered apologies into the howling wind, words that trembled with sincerity and despair. The pain of my past was laid bare, and in doing so I realized that perhaps redemption was not an impossible dream, but a path that began with acceptance of my own faults. The storm gradually abated, and as the first light of dawn crept into the canyon, La Dama's form began to dissolve into the pale glow of morning. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, the echo of her sorrowful gaze lingering in the silence that followed the storm. I had been broken open by the desert's harsh truth, and in that brokenness I found a fragile resolve to set things right, even if I might never fully escape the shadows of my past. I eventually made my way back to the RV, the storm's fury giving way to a calm that was both eerie and hopeful. The once flickering lights of the RV seemed to burn a little steadier now, as if the vehicle itself had absorbed some of the desert's ancient resolve. I knew that I could not undo the wrongs of the past, but I could at least carry the memory of that night as a lesson, a warning to never let my guilt turn into the darkness that consumes everything. I left El Malpai with a fragile hope for redemption, the image of La Dama's sorrowful eyes forever imprinted in my mind. Even now, as I drive away from that desolate beauty, I sometimes feel that she is still watching, guarding the secrets of the desert, ensuring that those who wander here confront not only the harsh realities of nature, but also the demons within their own souls. The journey taught me that sometimes the most terrifying ghosts are not those that haunt the night, but those that reside in the depths of our own hearts. In the end, the desert did not offer the escape I once craved. Instead, it forced me to confront the parts of myself I had long tried to ignore, leaving me forever changed. And as I continue to travel down the long, winding roads of this vast, indifferent land, I carry with me the quiet, persistent hope that acknowledging one's guilt is the first step toward finding peace, even if the shadows of El Malpais will always whisper reminders of that fateful night. My name is Alice Monroe. I'm 34 years old. This happened when I left behind a life of unanswered questions and boarded my old RV, determined to follow the cryptic clues my missing father left behind. I had spent years chasing whispers about his disappearance, his faded tape recordings, his battered journal filled with mysterious notes, and a deep-seated suspicion that there was more to his work than anyone was meant to know. With my RV loaded with essential gear, recording equipment, and my father's journal clutched tightly in my bag, I set out into the arid, unforgiving expanses of West New Mexico, my heart heavy with both resolve and dread. The road to El Malpai National Monument was long and desolate. Each mile I put between myself and the familiar buzz of city life only amplified the static of uncertainty in my mind. Early in the journey, I began noticing anomalies. The RV's radio, which usually hummed with the soft murmur of classic tunes or weather updates, started picking up bursts of harsh static and garbled voices. I'd glance at my electronic devices. They'd flicker and stutter as if the desert itself were interfering with the modern technology I relied on. One afternoon, while parked near a bizarre rock formation that jutted out of the desert like an ancient relic, I discovered faded markings etched into the stone. They looked almost like coded warnings, alongside fragments of what appeared to be an old government memo. My pulse quickened as I realized these signs could be connected to the very mystery I was pursuing. That first night, the desert sky was a deep canvas of ink, pierced by a scattering of distant stars. I sat inside my RV, listening to the persistent hum of the engine as it worked hard to keep the cold desert at bay. Then, as if on cue, the radio crackled to life. Through the dense veil of static, a distorted voice emerged, murmuring, "They're watching. Stop digging." I froze, my heart pounding in my ears. The message was unnervingly familiar. It mirrored the anxious tones of my father's final recordings. I fumbled with the dial, desperately trying to clear the interference, but the voice only repeated its warning over and over. I knew then that my quest was attracting forces far beyond my control. A few days into my journey, I pulled over at an abandoned gas station along a lonely stretch of highway. The station was in ruins, a relic of a bygone era, its peeling paint and broken windows silently testifying to years of neglect. While I refueled and made a brief stop to stretch my legs, an old man approached me. His skin was weather-beaten, and his eyes carried the weight of countless desert secrets. In a hushed, gravelly tone, he said, "Some truths are buried for a reason, young lady. You're treading dangerous ground." Before I could ask who he was or what he meant, he melted into the dusty horizon, leaving behind a lingering unease and the unmistakable feeling that I was being warned off. Despite the ominous encounter, I pressed on, following the mounting evidence toward an abandoned government outpost rumored to lie hidden near El Malpais. The RV's mechanical problems worsened along the way. A persistent cough from the engine, flickering lights, and an ever-increasing interference on the radio that now resonated with an almost spectral quality. When I finally reached the outskirts of the outpost, the desolation was overwhelming. Rusted surveillance equipment lay scattered amid broken concrete. Discarded files were strewn about like the remnants of a forgotten past, and shattered computer terminals glowed dimly with the last flickers of power. Among the chaos, I discovered a set of declassified documents, one of which bore annotations in my father's unmistakable handwriting. It mentioned static echo in the context of a covert government experiment aimed at manipulating radio frequencies to influence human behavior. The implications were staggering. My father had been on the verge of exposing something monumental, something that might have led to his disappearance. I spent hours combing through the debris, my mind racing as I tried to piece together the fragments of his research. Every document I uncovered added layers of complexity and danger to the mystery. The more I learned, the more I felt as though I were uncovering truths that powerful people desperately wanted to keep hidden. And then, as dusk began to settle over the barren landscape, I heard it. A low, persistent sound that wasn't entirely mechanical. The RV's radio, which had become my unreliable companion, erupted into a cacophony of static interspersed with distorted voices. Among the noise, I distinctly heard my father's voice urging caution, as if warning me to back away. I knew then that I wasn't alone. Forces were converging on this very spot, and they were not pleased with my intrusion. I decided to leave the outpost and head back toward my RV, but fate had other plans. As I drove along a narrow, dusty road, the RV suddenly shuddered violently. Before I could react, a convoy of black SUVs appeared out of nowhere, encircling me with the precision of a military operation. Shadows moved swiftly and silently as a group of men in dark uniforms emerged from the vehicles. Their expressions were cold and unreadable as they ordered me to pull over. I could feel my heart racing, every instinct screaming to run, but I knew resistance was futile against such overwhelming force. They demanded I surrender all evidence, the journal, the documents, every scrap of proof I had collected. Their voices were devoid of emotion, yet carried a chilling finality. In the ensuing chaos, one of the agents set my RV ablaze. Flames licked the sides of the vehicle, sending plumes of acrid smoke into the twilight sky. With no time to spare, I abandoned the RV and fled on foot into the open desert. The night was a disorienting blur of frantic footsteps, the relentless hum of static, and the shouts of pursuing agents echoing across the barren landscape. I ran blindly, the oppressive darkness and the oppressive noise merging into a single, terrifying force that threatened to engulf me. Every step felt like a descent into deeper isolation, and the cold desert air stung my skin as I pushed onward, fueled solely by the desperate need to survive. After what felt like an eternity of running, I managed to lose my pursuers in the vast, shifting sands. Exhausted and battered, I stumbled upon a secluded cave near the abandoned outpost, a hidden sanctuary carved out by nature itself. The cave was cool and silent, a stark contrast to the chaos I'd just escaped. There, in the dim light of a dying flashlight, I found something that made my heart stop. A final recording left by my father. It was tucked away in a small weathered box, almost as if someone had meant for me to find it eventually. With trembling hands, I set up my portable recorder and listened. In his fragile, wavering voice, my father revealed the true nature of the static echo. He explained that the mysterious signal wasn't just a byproduct of human technology, it was something else entirely. An otherworldly phenomenon that had inadvertently tapped into a realm beyond our understanding. He spoke of experiments that had straddled the line between science and the supernatural, of forces that could warp reality itself. His final words were both a warning and a plea, a desperate call for the truth to be acknowledged, no matter how terrible the cost. As I sat there in the silence of that cave, the static from my broken radio seemed to echo his final message. I felt an overwhelming mix of sorrow, anger, and determination. The journey that had started with a search for answers had transformed into a battle against an unseen enemy, a conspiracy that reached far deeper than I had ever imagined, involving not only shadowy government operatives, but also forces that defied rational explanation. Now, as I prepare to leave the relative safety of the cave, I am filled with a sense of foreboding and uncertainty. I know that continuing my quest will mean facing not only human treachery and relentless pursuit, but also the eerie, supernatural pulse that permeates this desolate land. The static on my radio is a constant reminder that some signals never fade, and that the truth, no matter how painful or dangerous, is worth chasing, even if it means walking a path from which there may be no return. Every day, as I journey deeper into the heart of the desert, I am reminded of the sacrifices made by those who sought the truth before me. My father's voice, echoing through that final recording, serves as both inspiration and a grim warning. Some secrets are buried for a reason, and yet, here I am, driven by an insatiable need to uncover what lies hidden beneath layers of government cover-ups and supernatural phenomena. I move forward, step by uncertain step, with nothing but my wits, the fragments of my father's research, and the haunting static that follows me like a specter. The road ahead remains shrouded in mystery, fraught with danger, and filled with unanswered questions. But I cannot turn back now, not when the truth is so tantalizingly close, and my father's final message resonates in every crackle of the radio. The desert may be vast and unyielding, but within its barren expanse lies the key to understanding a past steeped in secrecy and the dark forces that continue to shape our world. I take a deep breath, steady my resolve, and step out of the cave into the cool embrace of the early dawn. The static echoes behind me, a constant reminder of the battle yet to come. I walk toward the rising sun, toward the uncertain future, knowing that, while the path may be perilous, I must pursue the truth, no matter where it leads. My name is Elena Martinez. I'm 34 years old. This happened last summer, when I decided to leave behind the suffocating memories of my past and seek solace in the abandoned ghost town of Pinos Altos, near Silver City, New Mexico. I had long been haunted by family secrets, rumors of a curse that had shadowed our bloodline for generations, and the legends of a sorrowful spirit known as the Weeping Widow. With my old RV as my only companion, I set out to confront both the demons within me and those lingering in the ruins of a forgotten town. The drive out to Pinos Altos was marked by persistent unease. Even before I arrived, my RV began acting up. The lights flickered intermittently, and my radio sputtered static instead of friendly voices. I chalked it up to the miles and age of the vehicle, but deep down, I wondered if these were signs that fate had already begun its dark work. When I finally pulled up on the outskirts of the ghost town, the RV's unreliable electrical system plunged me into intermittent darkness, isolating me from any immediate help. I parked in a dilapidated lot just beyond the crumbling remnants of what was once a vibrant settlement. The buildings, now skeletal frames overtaken by dust and decay, loomed like silent witnesses to a past steeped in tragedy. I noticed strange symbols crudely etched into the stone walls and wooden beams, cryptic designs that hinted at ancient rituals and unresolved sorrow. As dusk fell, a cold wind swept through the empty streets, carrying with it a distant, mournful wail that sent chills down my spine. I wasn't alone in my fascination with the town's dark legacy. While exploring a narrow, overgrown lane behind the main square, I encountered Hector Ramirez, a grizzled, elderly man who had long taken on the role of caretaker for these forsaken ruins. His weathered face, creased with decades of hardship, broke into a wary smile when he saw me. "You've come looking for answers, haven't you?" he rasped, his voice low and burdened. Pinos Altos holds secrets that are best left undisturbed. The Weeping Widow, she's not just a ghost, you know. They say her curse is tied to blood and betrayal. His eyes, dark and searching, warned me of the peril that lay ahead. I pressed him for more details, but all he would say was, "Keep your distance and heed the warnings of the past." Later that day, determined to understand the full extent of the curse that had drawn me here, I made my way to Silver City. At the small local library, I met Maria Delgado, a dedicated librarian and amateur historian with a passion for preserving the town's tragic history. Maria's gentle demeanor and empathetic eyes lent an air of quiet reassurance, but as she spoke about Pinos Altos, her voice wavered. She told me of a terrible injustice committed long ago, a story of betrayal, lost love, and an unquenchable grief that had given birth to the Weeping Widow. According to local lore, the spirit roamed the ghost town in a tattered black gown, her endless sobbing a lament for the life stolen from her. Maria hinted that my own family history might be intertwined with this curse, though she urged caution in drawing conclusions. I left the library with more questions than answers, and a subtle dread that perhaps I was digging into secrets that might never let me go. On my return journey to Pinos Altos, I encountered a mysterious trucker on a desolate stretch of highway. His battered truck pulled alongside mine for a brief, wordless moment. In a gravelly voice filled with warning, he said, "Keep your eyes open. There are things in these parts that don't take kindly to strangers. And sometimes the past finds a way to reach out and claim what's rightfully its own." His cryptic words only deepened my apprehension, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Back at my RV, the equipment continued to fail me. The dim glow of my failing battery barely lit the interior during long, sleepless nights. As I sat alone in that unreliable half-light, the silence was punctuated by the occasional whisper of wind and the soft, sorrowful sound of crying, as if someone were weeping just outside my door. It was on one such night that I first truly felt the presence of the weeping widow. In the darkness beyond the cracked window, I caught a fleeting glimpse of a figure in a tattered black gown drifting among the ruins. Her eyes, if they could be called that, seemed filled with endless despair, and her mournful wails mingled with the howling wind, echoing the lamentations of my own buried regrets. As the days passed, the isolation began to take its toll. I found myself wandering the empty streets of Pinos Altos, drawn inexorably to the sites marked by inexplicable symbols and haunted by memories I'd long tried to forget. Each step felt like a descent deeper into both the physical and psychological labyrinth of the town's past. I started experiencing vivid nightmares, visions of a woman weeping over a grave, of shadows moving in the corners of my vision, of being trapped in a never-ending cycle of sorrow and rage. One particularly bitter night, as a storm brewed on the horizon, I heard the sound of approaching footsteps outside my RV. Before I could react, rough, gloved hands grabbed me, and I was dragged out into the tempestuous darkness. The next moments were a blur of terror and chaos. I found myself blindfolded and bound, taken to a secluded, abandoned building on the edge of the ghost town, a place that reeked of decay and forgotten sins. There, in a dimly lit chamber filled with crude symbols and the acrid smell of burning incense, I came face to face with my captors, members of a clandestine cult who had dedicated themselves to the worship of the weeping widow. Their leader, a gaunt man with fervent eyes, began chanting in a language I couldn't understand, his voice rising and falling in an eerie cadence. They claimed that by transferring the ghost's cursed legacy into me, they could break the cycle of her unending grief, and in turn free themselves from her wrath. The cultists subjected me to a series of ritualistic torments, both physical and psychological, that left me trembling with pain and fear. They cut shallow marks into my skin and forced me to listen to their incantations, each word hammering home the notion that I was now part of something ancient and malevolent. In the midst of my despair, my mind raced back to the warnings of Hector and the cryptic words of the mysterious trucker. I realized that the true horror was not just the ghost that haunted these ruins, but the dark human heart capable of exploiting ancient grief for their own twisted ends. As the cultists pressed in around me, their eyes alight with a fanatical zeal, I clung to the fragments of strength I had left. I began to silently plan my escape, every nerve in my body alert to the slightest shift in the shadows. During a brief lapse in their vigilance, a moment when one of the cultists left the room to fetch more supplies, I managed to free one of my wrists from its bindings. With a surge of adrenaline, I wrenched myself away from the circle of my captors. I stumbled through the labyrinthine corridors of the abandoned building, the sound of chanting echoing in the distance, until I burst out into the open air. The storm had broken, rain lashing against my skin as I ran blindly into the dark desert night. Every step away from that accursed place was a battle against the searing pain and the unyielding terror that had taken root in my heart. I navigated the uneven, broken pavement of Pinos Altos, the harsh wind driving me forward as the echoes of the cult's chants faded into the distance. I didn't stop until the ghost town's spectral silhouette was nothing more than a dark smear on the horizon. I sought refuge in an old, abandoned farmhouse on the outskirts of Silver City, where I tended to my wounds and tried desperately to piece together what had happened. In the days that followed, the haunting memory of my ordeal remained as vivid as the storm itself. I learned later that Maria Delgado, the kind librarian who had once offered me a glimpse into the town's tragic history, had vanished under mysterious circumstances shortly after our meeting. Her disappearance, like so many other unanswered questions, added another layer of sorrow and uncertainty to my already fractured world. Even now, as I sit in the relative safety of a modest motel room far from New Mexico's desolate landscapes, I cannot shake the feeling that I am forever marked by the events that transpired in Pinos Altos. The weeping widow's spectral presence still haunts my dreams. In the dead of night, when the wind howls outside my window, I sometimes think I hear her mournful cries, a reminder that some curses, once invoked, are never truly laid to rest. I've tried to resume my life, to rebuild from the fragments of my shattered self, but every shadow and every whisper carries the weight of that dark summer. The cult's rituals, the taste of fear, the scars both visible and hidden, they have all become part of me. And I know now that escaping the past is not as simple as leaving it behind. Some legacies are written in the very fabric of your soul. I still wonder about the true nature of the curse that tethered the weeping widow to Pinos Altos, and whether my own family's history is forever intertwined with her sorrow. Was I chosen by fate, or merely an unfortunate victim of circumstance? The answers remain as elusive as the ghost herself, and sometimes I fear that, in the quiet moments before dawn, I might hear her voice calling out to me, beckoning me back to a place where pain and longing never truly end. That night in the abandoned building, as I faced the twisted fervor of men who believed themselves conduits for an ancient curse, I learned a bitter truth. The most terrifying monsters are not always the ones born of myth, but those who lurk in the hearts of men, harnessing old legends to justify their own cruelty. And even though I escaped with my life, I carry with me a piece of that darkness, a lingering echo of a past that refuses to be forgotten. Now, I live with the constant reminder that the desert holds many secrets, and some of them are not meant to be unearthed. The road ahead is long and uncertain, but I know one thing for sure. I will never forget the ghost town of Pinos Altos, the tormented spirit of the weeping widow, or the night that changed everything. The echoes in the dust are my constant companions, whispering that even in freedom, I remain forever bound to the legacy of that cursed land. My name is Rafael Cortez. I'm 42. This happened last summer, when I decided to leave behind the ruins of my former life and seek redemption in the endless, unforgiving expanse of the Mesilla Desert. I loaded my battered RV with nothing more than a few belongings and the heavy burden of guilt that had haunted me for years, and I set out along the sun-scorched highways near Mesilla, New Mexico. From the moment I left the city, I sensed that fate had something in store for me. The RV, a relic that had served me faithfully for years, began to sputter as if protesting the long journey ahead. I forced a smile, blaming the old engine for its age, but deep inside I wondered if this was a sign that the desert itself was conspiring against me. The vast, barren landscape of the Mesilla Desert stretched out before me like a canvas of heat and isolation. Every mile seemed to strip away the remnants of my past until I was left with nothing but my own thoughts. It was during one of those long, solitary drives that I first noticed something odd in my rearview mirror, a fleeting, distorted reflection that wasn't quite my own. I dismissed it as a trick of the light, a byproduct of fatigue and the relentless glare of the desert sun. But as the days wore on, these strange reflections became harder to ignore. One afternoon, with the horizon shimmering in waves of heat, I pulled into a dilapidated service station on the outskirts of Mesilla. The building, with its peeling paint and rusted sign, looked like it had been abandoned for years, yet a solitary figure stood behind the counter. His face was weathered and lined with decades of hardship. He introduced himself as Salvador Sal Gutierrez, a local mechanic who ran the station, and perhaps more importantly, someone who seemed to know the desert's hidden secrets. "Keep an eye on your mirror, boy," Sal said in a gravelly voice as he examined my RV's sputtering engine. "This desert's got a way of showing you things you'd rather not see." His words sent a chill down my spine, especially coming from someone who had weathered the harsh realities of these parts. I pressed him for more details, but he only offered a cryptic smile and added, "There's talk around here of a mirrored ghost, an evil twin that roams these roads. Just remember, sometimes what you see is more than just a reflection." Before I could ask another question, Sal disappeared into the dusty afternoon, leaving me with his warning echoing in my ears. I resumed my journey, but the RV's problems only worsened. The engine groaned in protest with every mile, and I found myself forced to slow down on deserted stretches of highway. It wasn't long before I noticed footprints in the dust near where I had parked for a brief rest. At first, I assumed they were the work of an animal, but the shape and size of the prints were disturbingly human. And then there were the reflections, at roadside pools of stagnant water, in the cracked glass of my RV's window. Always a momentary glimpse of a figure that looked exactly like me. The isolation of the desert began to seep into my mind. Communication devices that once connected me to the world around me now emitted only static. I was cut off completely, left alone with my racing thoughts and the oppressive heat of the endless dunes. At night, the darkness was absolute, punctuated only by the flickering of my failing RV lights. In that half-light, I started to hear something strange. A low, distorted voice over the CB radio, one that mimicked my own tone perfectly. It spoke of past sins and whispered accusations, dredging up memories I'd long tried to bury. I tried to convince myself that it was just the desert playing tricks on my mind, but deep down, I knew there was something else at work. The desert was vast and indifferent, yet it had a way of amplifying every fear, every regret. As the days passed, I found myself growing increasingly paranoid, my sleep tormented by nightmares of a doppelganger, a twisted version of myself with eyes that burned with unspoken accusations. One evening, a violent sandstorm swept in with little warning. The wind howled like a chorus of damned souls, and the RV's structure rattled under the barrage of grit and debris. Forced to seek shelter, I abandoned my struggling vehicle and took refuge in an old, abandoned roadside diner that I spotted on the outskirts of a small, forgotten town. The building was a relic of a bygone era, its neon sign flickering weakly as if trying to signal a past that was now lost to time. Inside, the diner was in decay, tables overturned, wallpaper peeling from damp walls, and the air heavy with the scent of rust and dust. As I huddled in a corner, trying to shield myself from the biting wind and lashing sand, I felt the oppressive weight of loneliness and regret bearing down on me. The diner, with its shattered windows and eerie silence, felt like a tomb, a place where the past was locked away, yet still hauntingly present. It was in that moment of isolation that I first saw him, my doppelganger. He emerged from the shadows like a specter, a mirror image of myself, but with an intensity that was anything but comforting. His eyes were dark and unyielding, filled with a cold fury that seemed to pierce straight through me. For a long, agonizing moment, we simply stared at each other, two halves of the same tormented soul, one reflecting all the guilt and regret I had spent years denying. The doppelganger's lips moved, and in a voice that was both mine and distinctly alien, He began to speak of the mistakes I had made, the betrayals I had committed, and the life I had left in ruins. Every word felt like a dagger twisting in my heart, forcing me to confront the very demons I had tried so desperately to escape. The confrontation was not just physical, it was a battle of wills, a struggle to reconcile the man I was with the man I had become. The air in the diner grew thick with tension as the sandstorm raged outside, and in that moment, the desert itself seemed to hold its breath. I remember the shock of it all, how every lie I had told myself, every regret I had hidden away, surged forth in that eerie, charged silence. The doppelganger's form flickered and shifted with each accusation, as if he were composed of nothing more than the fragments of my shattered past. The voice on the CB radio, the cryptic warnings from Sal, the unexplained footprints, all of it converged in that fateful encounter. It was as if the desert had become a crucible, forging the darkest parts of my soul into a tangible, malevolent force. For what felt like an eternity, we circled each other in the dim light of the abandoned diner. The doppelganger's presence was overwhelming, a constant reminder that I could never escape the shadow of my own guilt. I realized that the terror I had been fleeing wasn't some external monster, it was me. My failures, my regrets, my self-loathing had taken form in that mirror image, and now I was forced to confront it head-on. In the midst of that harrowing confrontation, something shifted inside me. Amid the barrage of painful truths and raw emotion, I felt a spark of understanding, a realization that perhaps the only way to banish this spectral tormentor was to finally accept responsibility for my past. With every ounce of strength I could muster, I took a step forward, not to fight him with fists or words, but to embrace the man I had been and the mistakes I had made. I whispered an apology to the echo of my own soul, a plea for forgiveness from a self I had long denied. The response was almost immediate. The doppelganger's form began to waver, his once fierce eyes softening into a reflection of sorrow and resignation. The air in the diner lightened imperceptibly, as if the heavy burden of guilt was being lifted piece by piece. Outside, the sandstorm began to subside, the howling winds giving way to a tentative calm. In that fragile moment, I felt a glimmer of hope, a chance to start anew, free from the relentless torment of my own making. When dawn broke, its pale light filtering through the dusty windows of the diner, the apparition of my doppelganger had vanished. I stood alone amid the wreckage of the old building, battered both physically and emotionally, yet with a newfound resolve that I hadn't felt in years. I knew that the journey ahead would not be easy, that the desert, with all its relentless brutality, would continue to test me. But I also knew that I could no longer run from the past or hide from the darkness within. I returned to my RV, which, despite its mechanical woes, still carried the scars of our journey, a testament to the harsh truths of the desert. As I resumed the long, solitary drive across the barren landscape, I couldn't help but glance at the rearview mirror every now and then, half expecting to see that haunting figure once more. But instead, I saw only my own tired reflection, a man marked by regret, but also by the faint promise of redemption. The Mesilla Desert had stripped me bare, exposing every flaw and every hidden sin. Yet, in that crucible of isolation and relentless heat, I had discovered something vital. The only way to truly move forward was to face my own reflection, to accept the darkness that lived within, and to find the strength to let it go. The journey toward redemption was far from over, but as I drove away from that desolate stretch of highway, I carried with me the conviction that sometimes the most terrifying monsters are the ones we create within ourselves, and that the path to healing begins when we finally dare to confront them. Even now, as I navigate the uncertain roads of my new life, I still hear the echoes of that fateful summer. The warnings whispered by a grizzled mechanic, the distorted voice on the radio, and the silent gaze of a doppelganger who was once my own reflection. But those echoes no longer terrify me. Instead, they serve as a constant reminder that I have faced my inner darkness and emerged, however scarred, with a fragile hope for redemption. My name is Marcus Rivera. I am 37 years old. This happened one scorching autumn in the outskirts of Silver City, New Mexico, a place where the desert's isolation hides secrets older than time. I had assembled a ragtag group for an RV camping trip into the forgotten corners of the West. Elena Cruz, whose intuition about the supernatural was as unsettling as it was sincere. TJ Robinson, a thrill-seeker whose reckless charm often bordered on irresponsibility. And Sasha Delgado, a quiet soul with a mysterious past that made her seem both fragile and guarded. We set out with a singular goal: to explore an infamous abandoned mining town rumored to harbor dark legends. I needed this escape, not only to chase adventure but to find redemption from the personal losses that haunted me. The desert roads beckoned, promising both the beauty of solitude and the danger of isolation. Our aging RV was a patchwork of worn leather seats, a malfunctioning GPS, and rattling parts that groaned with every bump on the unyielding desert pavement. The journey began uneventfully, but the first signs that something wasn't right soon made themselves known. One evening, as twilight bled into night, I caught a glimpse of a distorted reflection in the cracked window of the RV. A fleeting image that resembled Sasha, but twisted and almost demonic in its contortion. I mentioned it to the group, but TJ just laughed it off, and Elena offered a nervous smile as if reassuring us that our imaginations were running wild. Our arrival near the abandoned mining town was marked by an eerie silence. We parked on a barren stretch of road just beyond Silver City, where the wind whispered through dilapidated structures and long-abandoned shafts. It wasn't long before we encountered a weathered trucker at a rundown diner, whose eyes were shadowed with decades of desert sorrow. He leaned in close and warned in a gravelly tone about the mirror, a name he claimed was spoken in hushed tones among local drifters. "It takes your reflection and turns it against you," he said, his words laced with genuine fear. I didn't dismiss his tale, but neither did I let it overrule common sense. That night, as a desert storm brewed, our RV shuddered with mechanical disobedience. The engine coughed, spluttered, and then died completely in the middle of an isolated stretch of desert road. We were stranded, our communication devices as unreliable as the flickering light bulb in the cab. In the oppressive darkness, the earlier sighting of the unsettling reflection returned with a vengeance. I could see with a mix of dread and disbelief the image of Sasha, or something that looked exactly like her, moving in the peripheral shadows of the RV. My heart pounded as I wrestled with the possibility that the trucker's warnings were more than mere superstition. As we fumbled for tools and searched for a solution to our mechanical woes, tensions simmered. TJ's impatience clashed with my insistence on caution, and Elena's repeated pleas to heed local lore only deepened the discord. Sasha remained silent, her eyes fixed on the dark horizon as if absorbing a secret too heavy to share. Before we could resolve our internal conflicts, a new terror struck. Out of the darkness, a black SUV pulled up with a violent jolt. Men in grimy, nondescript clothes surrounded our stranded RV with silent menace. I realized, with a sinking dread, that we had been ambushed by a local gang, criminals known to traffic drugs and even abduct travelers for ransom. In the chaos that ensued, while I struggled to secure the door, I heard a blood-curdling scream. Elena had been dragged from the RV. I remember the moment vividly. The crack of a metal pipe, her muffled cries as she was thrown into the back of the SUV, and the look of terror on her face seared into my mind. My pulse hammered in my ears as I realized we were not only facing an otherworldly terror but the very real brutality of human depravity. The ambush plunged our group into a vortex of violence and betrayal. Amid the ensuing chaos, TJ's eyes betrayed him. He exchanged furtive glances with one of the gang members. In a moment that felt like the betrayal of a lifetime, I later learned that TJ had struck a clandestine deal with these criminals, hoping to leverage our predicament for his own gain. I was torn between the need to save Elena and the realization that internal treachery had imperiled us all. I managed to fend off one of the attackers with a wrench, adrenaline dulling the pain of his blows, and I escaped into the darkness in pursuit of answers and, hopefully, a way to rescue Elena. The RV, our fragile sanctuary, lay abandoned, its doors left ajar like a wound in the desert night. With no time to waste, I rallied Sasha, her enigmatic gaze now seeming to hold both fear and something darker. "We need to follow them," I whispered, every word laced with urgency and despair. Sasha nodded, her silence no longer a mystery but a burden of its own. The trail led us to an abandoned mine on the outskirts of the town, a labyrinthine network of tunnels that, according to local lore, was the den of the Mirror. As we crept into the mine's gaping maw, every step echoed like a countdown to something dreadful. In the oppressive darkness, the air was heavy with both dust and dread. Shadows played tricks on our eyes, and the temperature plummeted in the cold underground corridors. Inside, I confronted the horrifying truth. The Mirror, a shape-shifting terror, revealed itself in a flash of ghastly light. It was not a singular entity but a malevolent force that had taken on the visage of Sasha, a reflection of all our hidden fears and guilt. In that moment, the creature's true nature unfolded, a grotesque mimic that sowed distrust among us, using our own reflections to turn our inner demons outward. I remember the confrontation as a nightmarish blur of snarls, shifting forms, and the acrid scent of fear. The mine's walls reverberated with the sounds of our struggle. I grappled with what I thought was Sasha, only to find my grip sliding off an arm that wasn't entirely human. The creature's eyes, if they could be called that, were pits of unending malice. It whispered in a voice that sounded like every regret I had ever harbored, its words a twisted mirror of my own thoughts. During the melee, TJ's betrayal came to a head. Under the influence of the mirror, his resolve crumbled, and he turned his makeshift weapon against us. The ensuing fight was brutal and desperate, my hands stained with both sweat and blood as I fought not only for my life, but for Elena's rescue. Amid the confusion, I caught a glimpse of Sasha's face contorting in agony, as if she were locked in an internal battle against possession. Was she truly one of us, or had the mirror claimed her entirely? The uncertainty gnawed at me, fueling my determination to end this nightmare. In a savage twist, the human traffickers reappeared, using the mine's claustrophobic corridors as their hunting ground. I pressed on, every muscle burning with determination, as I fought my way through a horde of attackers. Amid the struggle, I heard Elena's voice, a faint cry echoing through the tunnels. It spurred me forward, a beacon of hope in the Stygian dark. Reaching a cavern deep within the mine, I found Elena bound to a rusted support beam, her eyes vacant yet burning with a desperate spark. Her captors loomed over her, their faces twisted in cruelty as they continued their brutal interrogation. Without a second thought, I launched myself at them, every ounce of my being focused on freeing her. In the ensuing melee, blows were exchanged with a fury that blurred the line between man and monster. I felt the weight of betrayal, the sting of loss, and the raw, unfiltered terror of confronting both human and supernatural evil all at once. The battle was harrowing. Amid the clang of metal and the echoes of tortured screams, I managed to incapacitate several of the gang members. TJ, caught in the crossfire and disillusioned by his own treachery, fell. His betrayal costing him dearly as he was left battered and broken in the dim light of the cavern. I dragged Elena to safety, her body trembling, her spirit scarred by the horrors she'd endured. Outside, in the bitter chill of the desert night, the truth of our ordeal settled over us like a shroud. Elena, though rescued, was a haunted soul, a living testament to the cruelty of both the human heart and the supernatural. Sasha, for her part, vanished into the labyrinth of the mine during the chaos. Later, whispers would circulate that she had been possessed by the mirror, her fate forever entwined with the darkness we had confronted. In the days that followed, I was left to pick up the shattered pieces of our lives. The RV, our vessel of escape, remained broken, a cruel reminder of our vulnerability in the vast, indifferent desert. Elena's recovery was a slow, painful journey, marked by nightmares and a pervasive sense of loss. The betrayal of TJ left a bitter taste that no amount of time could erase, a reminder that even among friends, darkness can fester unchecked. The events in that forsaken mine changed me irrevocably. I had ventured into the desert seeking redemption, only to be confronted by a reflection of my own fears, the malevolent force known as the mirror. Its legacy, I realized, was not merely one of supernatural horror, but of the profound and terrible capacity for betrayal that exists in all of us. Now, as I write these words, I am haunted by the memories of that night. The echoes of violence, the spectral visage of the mirror, and the irrevocable scars left on our souls. I wander the desert roads alone, driven by a need to understand whether the horror we encountered was an aberration or a dark truth embedded in the very fabric of this forsaken land. In the end, survival meant more than escaping physical danger. It meant confronting the demons within, and accepting that sometimes the most terrifying reflections are our own. And as the desert wind continues to whisper its ancient secrets, I know that the memory of that night will forever be a part of me. A relentless reminder that in the isolation of West New Mexico, both human cruelty and eldritch horror can tear lives apart. The desert remains vast, its mysteries deep, and I carry the burden of that night with every step I take on these endless roads. My name is Jared Whitman. I am 44 years old. This happened one sweltering summer in Lordsburg, New Mexico, when I decided to flee my past and seek some form of redemption out in the endless, unforgiving desert. I had spent years haunted by the loss of my father and the bitter collapse of my marriage. With nothing left but memories and regrets, I bought an old RV, rusted, unreliable, and full of quirks, and set out to trace the routes my father once traveled. I thought that maybe, just maybe, the harsh solitude of the Chihuahuan desert could help me find a way to forgive myself. The desert greeted me with scorching days and freezing nights, its landscape dominated by twisted, ancient cacti standing like silent sentinels. I was drawn to a stretch of barren land near Lordsburg, where the land seemed to whisper secrets in the wind. My RV was my sanctuary and my prison all at once. A creaking, temperamental vehicle with a failing engine and a malfunctioning GPS that insisted on leading me astray. Yet, I pressed on, determined to confront both the physical and emotional demons that plagued me. Not long after I settled into a makeshift campsite, I noticed signs that something was amiss. The RV's engine sputtered during one particularly brutal afternoon, and I was forced to pull over on a narrow, dusty road far from any semblance of civilization. As I stood there, waiting for the stubborn motor to come back to life, I caught sight of a strange shadow moving among the gnarled cacti. At first, I dismissed it as a trick of the heat and my tired mind. But then came the whispers, soft, sibilant murmurs that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. I spent that night huddled in the dim light of my RV, listening to the wind howl and the desert's quiet voice. As darkness fell, my thoughts drifted back to my father, the sound of his voice, his stern yet gentle guidance, and the weight of his absence. I began to feel as though the desert itself was echoing my regrets. And then I saw it. A figure at the edge of the light, tall and shifting, formed entirely of jagged silhouettes of cactus spines. I later came to call it the thorn. At first, I thought the thorn was nothing more than a hallucination, a trick of my tired, grief-stricken mind. But as days passed, the encounters grew more vivid. The RV, already a source of constant frustration with its breakdowns and mechanical hiccups, became a battleground between my need to move forward and the mounting dread of isolation. One day, while driving along a desolate stretch of road, a sudden pop and a violent shudder threw me off balance. A tire had burst, and with it, my fragile connection to safety. I was forced to abandon the RV temporarily, leaving it parked under the merciless sun as I set out on foot to find help. It was on that lonely journey that I first came face to face with the thorn in earnest. I had been stumbling through the barren scrubland, my limbs heavy with exhaustion and my mind awash with painful memories, when I heard a rustling in the underbrush. I froze, my heart pounding in my ears. Before me, emerging from the deep shadows of a dense grove of twisted cacti, was a spectral figure. It wasn't an animal, it was a humanoid shape, its form composed of what looked like interwoven cactus spines and shifting desert dust. The entity moved with a deliberate, almost predatory grace, and in the fleeting moments I locked eyes with it, I saw something disturbingly familiar in its gaze. I ran, my feet pounding against the cracked earth, yet no matter how far I fled, the whispers of the thorn pursued me. It taunted me with fragments of a voice that sounded like my father's, mixed with the bitterness of my failed marriage. "You can't escape your past," it seemed to hiss on the wind. Each step I took felt like a step deeper into a nightmare where reality and hallucination blurred indistinguishably. After what felt like hours of desperate wandering, I stumbled upon a deserted campsite. The remnants of a recent struggle, a broken bottle, hastily discarded belongings, and deep marks in the sand told a grim tale. Someone else had been here, someone who had encountered a horror not entirely dissimilar from what I was now facing. That discovery shook me to my core. Was the thorn truly a supernatural force stalking the desert, or was it a manifestation of the repressed anguish I'd been trying so hard to bury? Bruised and battered from my escape, I finally managed to return to my RV. I set to work on a temporary repair, patching up what I could, all the while feeling the oppressive weight of the desert's gaze. Night fell again, and with it came another confrontation, this time more violent than before. I remember vividly the sound of the shattering glass as I tried to secure the RV's door, the taste of blood mingled with sweat, and the raw, unfiltered terror that gripped me as the thorn reappeared. Under a blood-red sunset, I found myself forced into a final confrontation. I had driven my patched-up RV to the edge of a grove of ancient, gnarled cacti, the only place that seemed to call out to me in both menace and invitation. There, in the twilight, the thorn materialized fully. It advanced slowly, its form shifting and rippling like living shadows cast by the dying light. As it approached, I felt every ounce of my repressed grief and guilt come crashing down in the cacophony of whispered accusations. "You left him. the entity seemed to say, and I heard echoes of my father's voice, a reminder of the day I'd failed to live up to his expectations. "You lost her," it murmured, blending with the memory of my shattered marriage. The words stung, each syllable a lash against my soul. I stood frozen, caught between the urge to flee and the desperate need to confront the monster that had become both a physical and emotional manifestation of my inner torment. My hands trembled as I fumbled for the tool I'd brought, a heavy, dented wrench that now felt like my only lifeline. The thorn circled me, its presence overwhelming, as if the desert itself had come alive to reclaim me. With each passing moment, the whispers grew louder, merging with my own internal dialogue until I could no longer tell where my voice ended and the entities began. I struck out, the wrench connecting with the force that sent shockwaves through my body. Pain exploded through my arm, but I barely registered it as I fought back with everything I had. The battle was a blur of agony and defiance. I managed to land a few desperate blows, the metallic sound of impact drowned out by the cacophony of my racing heartbeat and the relentless hiss of the thorn. It retaliated, its spiny form slashing through the air, leaving searing wounds that burned with a cold, otherworldly fire. In that excruciating moment, I realized that the fight was not just with an external demon, but with the cumulative weight of my entire life, a life filled with regrets, losses, and missed opportunities. Time lost all meaning as I teetered on the brink of surrender. The desert, in its indifferent majesty, bore silent witness to my struggle. And then, amid the violent chaos, something shifted. Perhaps it was sheer exhaustion, or maybe it was a sudden clarity born from years of inner turmoil, the realization that, to survive, I had to accept every painful piece of my past, to face it head-on rather than running from it. With a cry that was half defiance, half acceptance, I willed myself to stand firm. The thorn paused, its form wavering as if uncertain. For a fleeting moment, I saw in its shifting gaze a reflection of my own soul, a tortured, wounded, but resilient spirit. I pressed on, my resolve hardening with each passing heartbeat. Finally, as darkness fully enveloped the grove and the last vestiges of the blood-red sunset faded into night, the thorn began to recede, melting away into the shadows from whence it came. Whether it was truly defeated or merely biding its time, I could not say. All I knew was that I had stared into the abyss of my own despair, and found within me the strength to fight back. I returned to my RV, my body battered and my spirit scarred, yet somehow lighter. With the trembling hands, I managed to complete the temporary repairs on my vehicle. As I drove away from that cursed grove, the desert stretched out endlessly before me, a vast, indifferent expanse that now seemed both a prison and a sanctuary. The journey ahead was uncertain. Every mile was a reminder that the past, no matter how deeply buried, always leaves its mark. In the quiet solitude of the open road, I often found myself haunted by the memory of that final confrontation. Even now, as I navigate the lonely highways of New Mexico, I can't shake the feeling that the silhouettes of those ancient cacti whisper my name in the twilight. The thorn might have been an external horror, a specter born of the desert's ancient lore, or perhaps it was merely the embodiment of my inner despair. A twisted mirror reflecting everything I'd tried so desperately to forget. I continued to drive, each mile a step toward some undefined redemption. The desert, in its relentless, brutal beauty, has become my constant companion and my sternest teacher. Its vastness reminds me that survival is not just about overcoming external dangers, but also about embracing every scar, every regret, and every whispered memory of the past. And as the wind carries the faint, persistent murmurs of the cacti, I know that the question will always remain. Was the thorn real, or was it simply the echo of a tortured soul trying to find its way home? My name is Carmen Lopez. I am 35 years old. This happened one relentless autumn near Deming, New Mexico, a time when the desert's raw silence seemed to echo my own inner void. I had recently left behind a bitter divorce and a lifetime of secrets that had long haunted me. Desperate for a fresh start and determined to confront the ghosts of my past, I purchased an aging RV and set out to reconnect with the land of my ancestors, hoping that the vast, unforgiving mesa outside Deming might offer both solace and answers. I arrived at the mesa on a late afternoon, the dying sun casting long, eerie shadows over the rocky outcrops. I parked the RV in a small clearing at the base of the mesa, its battered frame a familiar companion on this journey of self-discovery. As I began setting up camp, I noticed something strange on the nearby rocks, symbols etched deeply into the stone, their lines precise yet disturbing. Nearby, in an abandoned, shallow depression, lay a scattering of ritualistic artifacts. Broken pottery, oddly shaped stones, and fragments of what looked like ancient talismans. At first, I dismissed these as the work of local vandals or some misguided art project, but as dusk fell, I discovered similar markings crudely scratched onto the side of my RV. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the cool desert night. The following morning, while I was refueling at a small service station in Deming, I met a drifter named Miguel. His sun-weathered face and quiet manner exuded a kind of rugged wisdom. He offered me some advice about the area, speaking in hushed tones about Los Silencios, a secretive cult that, according to local lore, still practiced dark, modern rituals rooted in ancient traditions. His words were cryptic, and his eyes, dark and searching, hinted at a connection to something far more ominous than mere rumor. He even suggested that my family might be entangled with these practices, a notion that made my heart pound with both dread and curiosity. Back at the mesa, my RV began to betray me. The engine sputtered intermittently, the power supply faltered, and one by one, the little comforts I had counted on were replaced by the raw, unyielding desert. That night, a violent sandstorm erupted, lashing the campsite with abrasive winds and choking dust. Trapped inside the RV, I listened as the storm howled like a living thing, and then, amid the roar of wind, I began to hear it. A low, rhythmic chanting that seemed to rise from the mesa itself. I peered out through the dusty windows and saw fleeting shadows flitting across the rugged rock formations, shapes that moved with a deliberate, almost ritualistic precision. The sense of being watched was overwhelming, and every gust of wind carried with it an undercurrent of menace. I barely had time to process these unsettling signs before the true horror descended upon me. One night, as I huddled in the dark with only the feeble light of my failing RV to guide me, masked figures emerged from the swirling sand. Before I could react, rough hands grabbed me and bound me with coarse rope. I struggled, my heart pounding in terror, as the figures, their faces hidden behind crude masks, overpowered me. In a matter of moments, I was dragged from the relative safety of my RV into the raging storm. They transported me to a hidden encampment nestled among jagged rocks high on the mesa. There, in the dim glow of a makeshift fire, I saw them gathered in a circle, members of Los Silencios, their eyes burning with fanatic intensity. The air was thick with the acrid smell of burning sage and something far fouler, like decaying earth. I was pushed to the center of their ritual space, my heart pounding as I realized they believed that my bloodline held a key to some forbidden power. Their murmurs and chants, laden with dark promises, sent shivers down my spine. Over the next several hours, or was it days, time lost its meaning in the haze of terror, I endured a series of harrowing rituals. They subjected me to both psychological torment and physical abuse, all in the name of invoking ancestral powers I had never known existed. Every whispered incantation, every harsh blow, and every mocking gesture from these zealots drove home the grim reality. I was caught in a nightmare, not of my own making, one that was intimately tied to the secrets I had tried so desperately to escape. In the midst of this torment, I clung to the hope that I might find an ally. I recalled Miguel's cryptic warnings and began to wonder if he might have been sent to watch over me. But then, in a moment that shattered any semblance of trust I had nurtured, one of the cult members revealed that Miguel was not here to help. The drifter I had come to trust, the one who had whispered ominous hints about my family's dark past, was in league with them. His betrayal cut deeper than any physical blow, leaving me with a searing sense of isolation and despair. The cult's ritual reached a fever pitch during one violent, electric night when the sandstorm outside intensified to a near-apocalyptic fury. Amid the chaos, a sudden, inexplicable power outage plunged the encampment into darkness. I saw my chance. In the ensuing confusion, I managed to break free from my bindings. The air was filled with screams and shouts as the storm battered our temporary prison, and I seized the moment to escape into the swirling maelstrom of sand and shadow. I ran blindly across the jagged terrain, my legs burning with exhaustion and fear. Every step was a battle against the unrelenting desert, every gust of wind a reminder of the cult's lurking presence. I knew my battered RV, parked far from the encampment, was my only hope of escape. With the storm as both cover and obstacle, I fought my way through the rocky landscape, using whatever I could find as an improvised weapon against those who pursued me. At one harrowing moment, I found myself cornered near a perilous cliff edge. The ground beneath my feet was unstable, and the abyss below beckoned with a silent promise of oblivion. My attackers closed in, their shouts muffled by the roar of the storm. Desperation surged within me, and I summoned every ounce of strength I had left. With trembling hands, I hurled a makeshift projectile, a heavy, jagged rock that struck one of my assailants squarely in the chest. The impact was enough to send him sprawling over the edge, and in that split second, I turned and sprinted toward my RV. Barely reaching the relative safety of my vehicle, I locked the doors and slammed the engine into life. The RV, despite its many faults, became my fortress on wheels. I sped away from the mesa, the storm gradually receding behind me. I knew I was far from safe. The cult's reach was insidious, and their betrayal burned within me like an unhealed wound. Yet, as I drove through the barren New Mexican landscape under a star-studded sky, I felt a tentative glimmer of hope. In the days that followed, I sought refuge in a small town where help was available. I reported what had happened to the local authorities, though their interest was as sparse as the desert's vegetation. The scars, both physical and emotional, ran deep. I spent long hours replaying every moment in my mind. The etched symbols on the rocks, the whispered chants, the betrayal of someone I thought was an ally. And I began to understand that the darkness I had encountered was not merely the product of a deranged cult, but of a family legacy that I had tried so hard to outrun. Even now, as I recount these events in the quiet solitude of my temporary shelter, I feel the weight of the mesa pressing down on me. The whispers of Los Silencios and the betrayal of Miguel remain vivid in my memory, a constant reminder that some shadows refuse to fade, no matter how far you drive from them. I stare out at the endless desert, its silent vastness, both a promise of freedom and a testament to the secrets that lie buried beneath its surface. I don't know what the future holds, or if I will ever fully escape the legacy that haunts me. All I know is that I survived that night of terror, that I fought back against forces both human and inexplicable, and that I emerged scarred but unbroken. As I continue to drive along the lonely highways of New Mexico, I can't shake the feeling that somewhere out there, amid the whispering winds and shifting sands, the cult's dark influence still lingers. And each time the desert breeze carries a whisper of my name, I wonder, how deep do the roots of my family's dark legacy truly go? Oh, 3 Mini. My name is Anna Morales. I'm 32. This happened on a weekend getaway that quickly turned into a waking nightmare in the rugged Organ Mountains Desert Peaks National Monument. I had been looking forward to a break from the city, to reconnect with nature and with old friends. We'd rented an old RV, a clunker with a history of mechanical issues, but we were too excited to care about its creaks and quirks. I'd always felt a deep connection to New Mexico's wild landscapes, and as I loaded up the RV with supplies, I couldn't help but feel that there was something almost sacred about these back roads. Our small group comprised a motley mix of personalities. Marcus Delgado, with his effortless charm and a glint of something unspoken in his eyes, was always the life of our adventures. Riley Carter, whose sensitivity bordered on the superstitious, had an uncanny knack for sensing when something was off. Sam Rodriguez, ever the rational mediator, kept our discussions grounded even when fear began to creep in. And then there was TJ Terry Jenkins, a wild card whose cocky disregard for caution often put him, and sometimes all of us, in harm's way. Our journey started off with a series of minor mishaps. On a steep, narrow trail, the RV's brakes failed unexpectedly, sending our hearts racing as we narrowly avoided a catastrophic plunge down the rocky slope. The GPS, our supposed guide, began glitching almost immediately afterward, rerouting us onto isolated, uncharted roads that seemed to lead deeper into the unknown. I tried to stay calm, but unease threaded through my mind as we set up camp near a cluster of juniper trees on the outskirts of a remote mesa known by locals as Devil's Tooth, a name that sent a chill down my spine even in daylight. That first night, as dusk melted into a starless void, strange symbols began appearing on the trees around our camp. I traced my fingers along the rough bark, noting carvings that echoed the ancient lore of skinwalkers, a shape-shifting creature of Navajo legend said to adopt the form of those it preys upon. I mentioned it quietly to Sam, who scoffed at the idea, attributing it to local pranksters or a case of overactive imaginations. But Riley's eyes, wide with dread, told a different story. She murmured about hearing soft, disembodied whispers just beyond the circle of our RV's weak light. As the night deepened, the tension in our small group began to unravel our camaraderie. Riley's persistent warnings clashed with Sam's insistence that we were simply tired and paranoid. Meanwhile, Marcus's behavior grew increasingly furtive. I caught him stepping away from the group more than once, speaking in hushed tones on his phone, his eyes darting nervously toward the darkened hills. TJ, never one to heed caution, laughed off our concerns until he too began to exhibit inexplicable nervousness. It was around 2 a.m. when the first real terror struck. I awoke to the sound of distant, agonized screams echoing through the canyon. My heart hammered as I unlatched the RV door and peered into the oppressive darkness. At first, I thought it was just the wind, or maybe an animal in distress, but then I saw a flash of movement. A figure that I swear resembled Marcus, but not quite. He was alone, slinking away into the shadowed crevices of the landscape. I called out to him, but he didn't respond. That was the moment when I realized that something was dreadfully wrong. Before we could regroup, the nightmare escalated. A violent ambush shattered the relative quiet of our campsite. Figures emerged from the darkness, masked, ritualistic, and utterly terrifying. In a chaotic flurry of shouts, crashing branches, and the heavy thud of boots on dirt, our group was attacked by a cult of cannibals. These cultists, twisted devotees who worshipped the skinwalker as a harbinger of dark power, moved with a predatory precision. They had been lying in wait near Devil's Tooth, and as soon as the ambush began, they herded us into a circle of despair. In the melee, Marcus's true allegiance was laid bare. He had been in clandestine contact with these people, trading secrets for promises of protection and power. I watched in horror as his eyes gleamed with a strange fervor, his voice melding into the frenzied chants of the cultists. He had lured us here, using our trust and the lure of the wild to set a trap we could not escape. Amid the chaos, Riley was snatched from our midst. I heard her terrified cries cut off abruptly as she was dragged away into the darkness, her fate sealed by the cult's grim rituals. TJ, ever the daredevil, had ventured out on his own earlier that night, and now bore the brutal cost of his recklessness. I later found him crumpled on a rocky slope, his leg mangled and body beaten, his eyes glazed with a mix of shock and something else, an eerie hint that the skinwalker's influence might have touched him. Sam and I managed to fend off a few attackers and duck into the cover of a nearby thicket, our breaths ragged and hearts pounding with the realization that our nightmare was only beginning. The terrain, once a promise of adventure, now morphed into a labyrinth of terror, where every rustle of wind and snap of a twig could herald the approach of our unseen tormentors. In the ensuing hours, as we huddled together in the dark, the true horror of our predicament sank in. Marcus, once our charismatic friend, had betrayed us, leaving us vulnerable to forces that defied understanding. And worse yet, the Skinwalker, an entity that defied human explanation, was not just a legend, but a malevolent force that moved among us, sowing discord and fear. Its presence was felt in the shifting shadows, the unnatural silence that fell over the hills, and in the whispered incantations of the cultists. Driven by desperation and a fierce determination to rescue Riley, Sam and I embarked on a perilous mission. We crept out from our hiding place under the cover of darkness, navigating the treacherous terrain with nothing but a failing GPS and a rough mental map of the area that I'd memorized from years of local lore. The cold air stung my skin as we advanced towards Devil's Tooth, a looming rock formation that seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy. Every step was a battle against time and terror. We could hear distant chanting, the echo of the cult's voices mingling with the eerie calls of nocturnal animals. At one point, as we neared the cult's makeshift encampment, I saw Marcus standing in the center of a crude altar, his face contorted in a mixture of ecstasy and horror as he recited words I couldn't understand. His transformation was so complete that I nearly didn't recognize him. The realization hit me hard. The man I had once trusted had willingly become an instrument of this evil. Our rescue attempt was as desperate as it was dangerous. Sam and I dodged cultists in the periphery, the sound of our frantic footsteps merging with the cacophony of ritualistic chanting. At one critical moment, I reached out to grab Marcus, hoping to appeal to whatever shred of humanity remained within him, but he recoiled as if struck. The betrayal was absolute, and in that moment, I felt an overwhelming surge of grief and anger. Inside the dark heart of Devil's Tooth, we found Riley bound and gagged in a small clearing, illuminated by a single flickering lantern. Her eyes widened with terror as I rushed to free her, whispering promises of safety that I wasn't entirely sure I could keep. But before we could make our escape, the Skinwalker made its presence known. It emerged from the shadows in a form that was both familiar and utterly alien, a contorted, shifting figure that seemed to wear the faces of those it had devoured. Its eyes, glowing with a malevolent intelligence, fixed on us with a predatory intent. A violent struggle erupted. The cultists, sensing that their dark ritual was unraveling, surged forward with renewed brutality. I fought with every ounce of strength I possessed, my hands shaking as I clutched a heavy branch in defense. Sam's rational calm was a stark contrast to the pandemonium around us, but even he could not fully explain the sheer terror that gripped our hearts. In the chaos, TJ reappeared, a broken, near-possessed shell of the man he once was. His limp and haunted gaze told a story of agony and transformation that no words could capture. The Skinwalker's influence had left him scarred in body and spirit, a living testament to the horrors that lurked in the dark corners of our world. I managed to pull Riley away from the encampment, but the cost was high. The cultists had regrouped, their fury echoing through the canyon as they pursued us relentlessly. Every step we took was haunted by the sound of shattering glass, splintering wood, and the unholy chorus of chants that grew louder with each passing moment. Desperation lent us a grim kind of courage. Sam, ever the voice of reason in the madness, guided us along a narrow, treacherous path up a rocky slope that led away from Devil's Tooth. Behind us, the cultists' shouts and the unearthly growls of the Skinwalker receded into the night. We didn't stop until we were sure we had put a few miles between us and that cursed place, our lungs burning and our limbs trembling from exhaustion. In the aftermath, as dawn broke and revealed a landscape scarred by violence and sorrow, we were left to confront the shattered remnants of our friendship and trust. Marcus's betrayal cut deep, a bitter wound that made every memory of our shared past seem like a lie. Riley's silence, broken only by occasional haunted stares into the distance, spoke of a trauma too profound for words. TJ, now forever altered by his brush with the supernatural, limped behind us, a grim reminder that sometimes survival comes at a terrible price. We eventually made it back to civilization, though not without scars both seen and unseen. The authorities dismissed our accounts as the ramblings of traumatized minds, and local communities whispered about curses and dark forces, their voices tinged with a resigned fatalism. I often find myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see a flash of that contorted face lurking in the shadows of everyday life. Even now, as I write these words in the quiet of my modest apartment, the memories of that night haunt me. I replay every moment, the faulty RV brakes, the glitching GPS, the strange symbols on the trees, and the final gut-wrenching betrayal of a friend I once trusted. The Skinwalker, with its predatory cunning, remains an ever-present specter in my mind. A reminder that some evils are not confined to myth but lurk in the very heart of our world. I know now that the isolation of the wilderness can strip away the veneer of civilization, revealing the raw, brutal truth about human nature and the supernatural forces that feed on our fears. I learned that trust is a fragile thing, easily shattered by the darkness that hides behind every smile and every whispered promise. And I learned, perhaps too late, that survival sometimes demands sacrifices that leave you haunted for life. As the days pass and the terror of that weekend slowly fades into an uneasy memory, I remain vigilant. The land still holds its secrets, and in the quiet moments before sleep, I sometimes wonder if the Skinwalker's gaze ever lingers upon me, waiting for the moment to return. Until then, I carry the scars of that descent into darkness, a constant reminder of the night when the wild, unyielding heart of New Mexico showed me that some nightmares are all too real. My name is Jack Morales. I'm 35 years old. This happened in late autumn when I decided to break free from the monotony of city life and head into the heart of Gila National Forest near Silver City, New Mexico. I'd invited my best friend, Miguel Mick Ramirez, and 2 others, Sarah Delgado, a local guide whose deep knowledge of these lands was both a blessing and a curse, and Elena Torres, whose charm masked ambitions far darker than any of us suspected. We piled into my aging RV, its engine a bit worn but still serviceable, and set off with high hopes of adventure and the thrill of uncovering local legends. I was determined to leave behind the ghosts of my past and embrace the raw, untamed wilderness. Little did I know, the forest had its own ancient, malevolent secrets waiting to be uncovered. The first day passed in uneasy calm. The RV rattled along the dusty roads as we made our way to a secluded clearing deep in the forest. That evening, while setting up camp, I noticed that something wasn't right. The engine had begun to sputter intermittently, and even my electronic devices, phones and GPS, flickered strangely, as if the forest itself were meddling with our modern conveniences. I chalked it up to the RV's age and the remote location, but a nagging sense of foreboding took root. After dinner, we ventured out a little to stretch our legs. Mick, ever the impulsive one, led the way down a narrow trail where we stumbled upon odd footprints pressed into the soft earth. There were also crude symbols carved into the trunks of ancient pines. The markings, almost ritualistic in their precision, sent a chill down my spine. Sarah explained in a hushed tone that local lore spoke of El Sombra, a skinwalker said to prowl these very woods, shifting shapes and preying on the unwary. Elena laughed it off at first, but even her smile faltered when a distant, unidentifiable rustle in the brush broke the silence. That night, the forest came alive with whispers and shadows. I lay awake listening to the RV's engine grumble in the background when I heard it, a low, guttural sound coming from outside. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then I remembered Mick's earlier excitement about seeing something strange. Sure enough, through the sliver of a cracked window, I glimpsed a shifting figure moving between the trees. Its eyes, when they caught the faint light of our campfire, burned like embers in the darkness. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. As days passed, our troubles compounded. The RV's mechanical issues worsened, leaving us stranded on winding back roads with no clear path back. Our supplies dwindled and tensions began to crack. The veneer of camaraderie that had initially held us together. Elena, in particular, started acting evasively. I noticed her secretive glances at her phone and hushed whispers on the side, and I began to wonder if her interest in the local legends was more than mere curiosity. One fateful night, under a moonless sky, everything unraveled. We had set up camp near an old logging trail when Mick, in his usual restless energy, ventured out to explore a nearby clearing. I heard his shout echo through the trees, a desperate cry that pierced the silence. I rushed out with Sarah close behind, only to find Mick standing frozen, his eyes wide with terror as he pointed toward the darkness. There, just beyond the flickering circle of our RV's lights, a grotesque silhouette stood. The creature's form was fluid, its outline shifting between human and beast, with eyes that seemed to sear into our very souls. Sarah's voice trembled as she whispered, "El Sombra." Before I could react, a group of figures emerged from the shadows. They were not ordinary trespassers, but members of a local cult rumored to be involved in unspeakable rituals. A cannibal cult entangled in human trafficking, using the legend of El Sombra to control their victims. In a heartbeat, chaos erupted. I remember the sound of shattering glass, the scrape of boots on gravel, and muffled screams echoing in the night. In the pandemonium, Elena's betrayal was revealed. I caught her in a furtive conversation with one of the cultists before she vanished into the darkness. Her eyes held a mix of fear and avarice that made my stomach churn. In the ensuing melee, the cultists, under the unholy influence of the skinwalker's malevolent presence, overpowered us. Amid the confusion, Mick was grabbed roughly, his desperate shouts for help lost in the tumult. I fought with everything I had, but there were too many of them. I clutched Sarah's hand as we retreated into the forest, our hearts pounding in terror and disbelief. The night seemed endless as we ran, the haunting echo of Mick's screams forever etched in my memory. The next morning, as dawn broke with a feeble light, Sarah and I emerged from the forest's edge, determined to find Mick. We discovered a trail of torn fabric and bloodied markings on trees, an eerie breadcrumb trail left by our attackers. Every step forward was a battle against the brutal elements, rocky slopes, hidden pitfalls, and the constant gnawing fear of being watched by something that defied explanation. Our pursuit led us deep into the heart of the forest, to an abandoned mining site long forgotten by time. The air was heavy with decay and the bitter scent of damp earth. There, among rusted equipment and crumbling structures, we found evidence of unspeakable acts. Faint traces of ritualistic markings were scrawled on the walls, and scattered belongings hinted at a violent struggle. My pulse pounded as I realized that this place was a nexus for the cult's dark activities, and perhaps the lair of El Sombra itself. Inside a dilapidated shack, we finally found Mick. He was barely recognizable, bruised and battered, his eyes vacant with trauma. His body bore fresh scars from the torture he'd endured, and his whispered words spoke of horror beyond human cruelty. They used me, he croaked, his voice barely audible, and El Sombra, it was there. I knelt beside him, feeling a deep surge of despair and anger. This wasn't just a random encounter, it was a calculated, violent trap that exploited our vulnerabilities. As we tried to nurse Mick's injuries and gather our wits, the cultists returned, alerted by our presence. A violent confrontation erupted in the crumbling corridors of the shack. The night was filled with the sounds of clashing metal, agonized screams, and the unearthly roar of the skinwalker as it manifested in a terrifying, shifting form. Sarah, with her deep-rooted knowledge of the land, led our desperate resistance. She recalled local legends and folk remedies, using makeshift tools to disrupt the cultists' rituals. Every swing of a rusted pipe, every desperate barricade we erected, was a fight for our lives. In the midst of the chaos, Elena reappeared. Torn between self-preservation and a flicker of remorse, she hesitated at a critical moment. Her indecision allowed the cultists to tighten their grip on us. In that brutal encounter, a minor local guide who had joined us briefly, someone whose quiet determination had been a beacon of hope, vanished without a trace, leaving us to wonder if he had been kidnapped or worse. The betrayal stung sharply as I realized that trust had been our most dangerous weakness. The ensuing battle was a blur of violence and supernatural terror. I remember the searing pain of a blow to my side, the acrid smell of burning wood and blood, and the relentless pursuit of that shifting, demonic figure, El Sombra, whose very presence seemed to twist the fabric of reality. With every moment, the forest closed in around us, a labyrinth of dread and despair. Finally, as the first rays of a weak sunrise filtered through the dense canopy, the cultists were driven back. Sarah and I managed to subdue a few of them, and we rescued Mick from their clutches. The aftermath was a scene of devastation, broken bodies, torn clothing, and the lingering stench of death mingled with the earth. Mick, though alive, was forever changed. His eyes held a haunted emptiness, a mirror of the horror he had endured. In the grim silence that followed, as we huddled together in the ruins of the mining shack, the full weight of our ordeal sank in. Elena had vanished once more into the depths of the forest, her betrayal unresolved and her fate unknown. Was she a coward, fleeing the consequences of her treachery, or was she consumed by the dark forces she had sought to harness? The question gnawed at me with every passing moment. We eventually limped back to our stranded RV, battered by nature and our own inner demons. The journey home was a blur of muted conversations, each of us lost in memories of that unholy night. The forest, with all its ancient mysteries and cruelty, had left scars that would never fully heal. And I still wake at night, recalling the ember glow of El Sombra's eyes, the whispered incantations, and the sound of betrayal echoing in the dark. In the weeks that followed, as authorities scoured the area for clues and local legends gained new life, I was forced to reckon with the fact that the true horror lay not only in the supernatural, but in the hearts of those we had trusted. Survival, I learned, wasn't just about battling external threats. It was about confronting the darkest parts of ourselves and the betrayals that could shatter even the strongest bonds. Now, as I write these words from the relative safety of my home, the memories of that fateful trip in Gila National Forest remain as vivid as the day they were etched into my soul. Mick survives, though the ordeal has left him scarred both physically and mentally, a constant reminder that some horrors refuse to fade with time. Sarah has become a quiet guardian of the forest's secrets, and Elena's whereabouts remain a bitter, unresolved mystery, a symbol of the treachery that can lurk in the most unexpected places. Every so often, when the wind is just right, I swear I hear whispers of ancient incantations drifting through the night air, and I wonder if El Sombra still prowls those dark, forbidding woods. For me, the line between the supernatural and human evil has forever blurred, and the shadows of Gila National Forest continue to haunt my every step. My name is Daniel Carter. I'm 42 years old. This happened during a long, unforgiving autumn when I decided to leave behind a past filled with guilt and regret. I'd lost my daughter several years ago, a loss that shattered me and left me wandering in search of redemption. With nothing left but memories and a battered vintage RV that had seen better days, I set out into the stark, relentless expanse of West New Mexico, determined to find a measure of peace in the vast solitude of the desert. I loaded my RV with the essentials, clothes, a few mementos of a happier time, and my old journal, the only confidant in my long, lonely nights. Driving along dusty highways that cut through the Chihuahuan desert, I felt both the burden of my past and the heavy silence of the landscape press in on me. Early in the journey, while rummaging through a forgotten storage compartment in the back of the RV, I discovered an old, weathered journal wedged between a box of tools and faded maps. Its pages were filled with cryptic entries and detailed sketches of a spectral presence known only as the Desert Mirage. The eerie tone of the writing sent a shiver down my spine, almost as if someone had been chronicling the inexplicable, just as I was now stepping into a realm where the line between reality and nightmare blurred. That first night near the outskirts of White Sands National Park, I parked on a flat stretch of sand under a sky smeared with stars. The RV's engine grumbled and coughed as it struggled against the cool desert air, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the ancient dunes were watching me. As I sat by a small, flickering campfire, the silence was suddenly broken by a distant, delicate laughter, a sound so soft it might have been the wind. But then, emerging from the darkness at the periphery of the firelight, I saw her, a small, ethereal figure of a child, dancing almost weightlessly on the edge of vision. Her presence was both heartbreaking and inexplicable, stirring memories of my own daughter, a ghostly echo of what I had lost. I blinked hard, and the figure faded into the shimmering heat of the desert night, leaving me unsettled and alone with my thoughts. A few days into my journey, while refueling at a deserted gas station on a lonely stretch of road, I encountered a man known to the locals as Old Pete. He was a wiry, weather-beaten hermit whose eyes carried decades of solitude and secrets. In a voice that trembled with both warning and sorrow, he told me about the desert mirage, a spectral presence that preyed on the souls of those burdened by guilt. "It takes your sorrow and makes it real," he rasped, pressing a small, tarnished amulet into my hand. "Wear this, son. It may protect you from what you don't want to face." His words, as cryptic as the journal I'd found, haunted me long after he shuffled away into the dusty twilight. As I continued deeper into the desert, the unease grew. My RV began to malfunction sporadically, its engine stuttering and the electrical systems flickering as if in protest of the barren land. Nights brought eerie, static-laden voices over the old radio, whispers of lost souls and long-forgotten tragedies. I couldn't tell if these were merely interference or something more sinister, a signal from a realm where guilt and grief converged. The isolation of the desert worked both as a balm and a torment. By day, the relentless sun and shifting dunes forced me to confront my inner turmoil, each mile an unyielding reminder of my past mistakes. By night, the landscape transformed into a hallucinatory stage where the lines between memory and supernatural horror began to blur. I started experiencing vivid hallucinations, fleeting images of my daughter's smiling face, distorted by the haze of sorrow, merged with the spectral figure I'd seen dancing among the dunes. In those moments, I wasn't sure if I was reliving my greatest loss or if the desert itself was playing cruel tricks on my mind. One afternoon, while navigating a narrow, deserted road carved between rocky outcroppings, my solitude was violently shattered. A group of rough-looking scavengers ambushed me. They emerged from behind the crags like vultures, shouting in a language laced with desperation and greed. Mistaking me for a wealthy traveler carrying valuable relics, perhaps even items tied to the mysterious journal I'd found, they tried to force me from my RV. The confrontation was brutal and chaotic. I remember the shock of a rough hand gripping my arm, the sound of fists striking, and the terror of being dragged away under the relentless glare of the desert sun. I fought back with everything I had, fueled by adrenaline and the raw will to survive. In the melee, one of the attackers was fatally wounded, and though I managed to break free, the encounter left me with fresh bruises and a deeper wound in my already fragile spirit. The violence was as real as the scars it left on my body, a stark reminder that in this unforgiving land, danger was always just around the corner. Shaken and battered, I eventually managed to escape back to my RV. With the engine sputtering and my heart pounding in my ears, I pressed on, though every mile now felt heavy with foreboding. The ambush had not only left physical marks, but had also deepened the isolation I felt, a sense that I was being hunted not just by men, but by forces beyond my control, drawn inexplicably by the escalating manifestations of the unexplained. I found myself steering toward an abandoned ghost town near the Tularosa Basin. The town, long deserted and succumbing to the elements, was a collection of crumbling buildings and silent, empty streets. The atmosphere was heavy with decay, and as I walked among the ruins, I felt the boundaries between my own haunted memories and the spectral presence that had dogged my steps growing ever thinner. Every broken window and rusted sign seemed to whisper of past tragedies, of lives lost to the relentless march of time and neglect. It was in this forsaken town that the full force of the desert mirage made itself known. Wandering the dusty, derelict streets, I sensed that I was not alone. Shadows shifted in the periphery of my vision, and the air grew inexplicably cold. Then, as I reached the center of the ghost town, I saw her again, the ghost child, this time unmistakably real. She appeared at the edge of a crumbling porch, her translucent figure illuminated by the eerie light of the rising sun. In her eyes, I saw a profound sadness and something achingly familiar, a reflection of the daughter I had lost. For a long suspended moment, time seemed to freeze. I could feel the weight of every regret and every tear I had shed, all converging into this one spectral being. Overwhelmed by the convergence of memory and supernatural terror, I fell to my knees. "I'm sorry," I whispered into the cold, empty air. "I'm so sorry, my little girl. I never meant for any of this to happen." As my voice broke with the intensity of my remorse, I felt as though the desert itself was listening, absorbing every word of my confession. In that raw, heart-wrenching moment, the apparition reached out, its form shimmering as if caught in a final ethereal embrace of forgiveness. Slowly, as if carried away by the whispering winds, the ghost child began to fade, dissolving into the hazy light of dawn. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, the silence after my confession heavy with both sorrow and a strange, bittersweet hope. The tangible presence of my past seemed to lift ever so slightly, leaving behind a gaping question. Could I ever find redemption in a land as unforgiving as the desert? With the first rays of the morning sun warming the cold stone beneath me, I knew that the journey ahead would not be simple or complete, but it was a start, a fragile step toward forgiving myself. I gathered what little I had left, re-entered my aging RV, and set off once again into the endless expanse of the desert. The scars from the recent ambush throbbed with each bump on the road, and my heart still ached with the raw pain of loss and guilt. Yet, in the silent company of the shifting dunes and the whispering winds, I felt that perhaps the desert mirage had been less a curse than a call to confront the parts of me I had long tried to bury. As I drove on, the old radio occasionally crackled with static, and for a moment I thought I could hear faint echoes of the ghost child's laughter mingling with the wind. The desert, with its unforgiving beauty and haunting mysteries, had become a mirror for my soul, a place where every shadow, every whisper, forced me to reckon with the past and consider the possibility of forgiveness. Even now, I cannot say for sure if the specters I encountered were truly supernatural or merely the projections of a guilt-ridden mind, but the journey has changed me irreversibly. The road ahead remains long and uncertain, paved with memories of pain and the slim hope of healing. I drive on, my battered RV a symbol of both my failures and my resolve, leaving behind the ghost town and the echo of a spectral child who may have been both my greatest loss and the catalyst for my tentative redemption. The desert continues to stretch out before me, vast and inscrutable, a constant reminder that, while some scars may never fully fade, every day brings the chance to search for a little light amidst the darkness. My name is Ethan Reyes. I'm 42 years old. This happened when I decided to escape the relentless noise of my past by venturing into the desolate badlands of Jornada del Muerto in western New Mexico. I thought solitude in the vast emptiness would help me silence the memories of a controversial military operation, a mission gone horribly wrong that left scars on my soul and cost too many lives. My RV was meant to be my refuge, a moving sanctuary to help me face my demons at my own pace. Instead, it quickly became a prison that trapped me between the unforgiving desert and the relentless echoes of my guilt. The journey started out uneventfully enough. I spent the first day driving along endless stretches of barren land, the horizon wavering in the heat. But as dusk fell, the RV's dashboard began to flicker, and my trusty GPS started acting up. One minute it was guiding me along a safe route, and the next it displayed a jumble of indecipherable symbols. Then came the radio static, an incessant, crackling noise that occasionally broke into faint, unsettling whispers. More than once I thought I heard my name murmured in the hiss of the speakers, as if the desert itself were calling me back to my past. That first night, I parked near a cluster of oddly shaped rock formations that looked almost man-made. The silence out there was profound, yet it was punctuated by the soft sighs of the wind as it swept across the barren ground. As I sat by a small, sputtering campfire outside the RV, my mind began to wander back to memories I'd tried to bury. Faces of fallen comrades, the clamor of battle, and the piercing sound of gunfire blended with the desert's own eerie music. It wasn't long before the isolation played tricks on me. I caught sight of a tall, gaunt figure in the periphery, a man in a tattered old military jacket, his presence as spectral as the guilt that weighed on my heart. I started calling him the Sentinel in my mind, a living embodiment of everything I wished I could forget. Over the next few days, the RV's problems worsened. Mechanical failures cropped up one after another, as if the very machine were conspiring with the desert to keep me isolated. Stranded in this harsh landscape, I had no choice but to venture out on foot for repairs, even as the scorching sun and swirling dust threatened to erode both my body and sanity. The radio continued its sporadic bursts of static, intermingled with voices that seemed to carry accusations, whispers of regret that merged disturbingly with my own inner monologue. Then, one sultry afternoon, I decided to stop at a rundown roadside bar in a small, forgotten town at the edge of the desert. The bar was dimly lit, with peeling wallpaper and a pervasive smell of stale liquor and dust. In a corner, I encountered a local drifter whose eyes seemed to have seen too much. Over a cracked mug of weak coffee, he leaned in and said in a low, gravelly voice, "You know, the desert devours those who flee from their past. Out here, every grain of sand holds a memory, and the land itself, she's alive with retribution." His words sent a chill down my spine, resonating with the doubts I had been battling silently. I left the bar with a heavy heart and an even heavier sense of foreboding. Back at the RV, the oppressive heat gave way to an unexpected violent sandstorm. The wind howled like 1,000 forgotten souls, and I struggled to secure the RV against the tempest. In the midst of that chaos, the boundary between reality and hallucination began to blur. I swear I saw the Sentinel again, this time standing right in front of me, his eyes hollow and accusing. His presence was overwhelming, and the storm's fury only amplified the surreal terror of the moment. The wind whipped sand into my face as I stumbled outside, desperate to salvage what I could from the wreckage of my vehicle. That's when it happened, the confrontation I had both dreaded and anticipated. Amid the swirling maelstrom, the Sentinel advanced. His form was no longer a mere shadow at the edge of my vision. He was fully there, a gaunt specter with a face etched in sorrow and reproof. As he moved closer, his voice, now unmistakably real, whispered all my deepest regrets and sins. With each step he took, I was forced to relive the horrifying flashes of that disastrous operation, the cries of the wounded, the acrid smoke of burning fields, and the unbearable weight of loss. In the midst of the storm, time seemed to warp. The desert around me dissolved into a chaotic blend of past and present. I fought to break free from the grip of my own memories and the spectral assault of the Sentinel. Our struggle was both physical and psychological. I swung blindly at the apparition, my fists meeting nothing but cold, shifting air. Every time I tried to defend myself, I was met with an overwhelming force that felt like my own guilt. Incarnate. The sand stung my eyes and skin, and the roaring wind drowned out any coherent thought, leaving only raw, unfiltered emotion. I don't know how long the battle lasted. Perhaps only minutes, perhaps an eternity. When the storm finally subsided, I found myself alone amidst the silent ruins of my RV. I was battered, my body bruised, and my spirit fractured, left standing on a landscape that now seemed indifferent to my suffering. The whispers of the sentinel had faded, and the oppressive presence that had haunted me was gone, leaving behind only a void filled with regret and aching uncertainty. In the eerie calm that followed, I sat amidst the debris, trying to catch my breath and gather my thoughts. The RV was a wreck, its mechanical heart silenced for good. My mind was a jumble of fragmented memories and raw emotion. I knew I had reached a crossroads. I could continue to run, hoping that by repairing the RV and moving on, I might somehow escape the relentless grip of my past. Or I could choose to confront the demons that had haunted me for so long. The choice wasn't clear, and the desert seemed to mock my indecision with its endless, unforgiving expanse. I spent the next few hours salvaging what little I could from the wreckage, each scrape and bruise a reminder of the battle I had just endured. The silence of the aftermath was deafening. There was no triumphant music, no cathartic release, only the raw, lingering dread that some parts of my past could never be mended. The drifter's words echoed in my mind. The desert devours those who flee their past. In that moment, I realized that I had been running for far too long. The land had shown me that the only way to find redemption was to face the memories head-on, no matter how painful they might be. As I prepared to make my way out of the battered remains of my once safe haven, I couldn't shake the image of the sentinel from my mind. He was no longer just a ghostly apparition. He had become a mirror reflecting the darkest parts of my soul. I wondered if repairing the RV would truly symbolize a fresh start, or if it would simply be another futile attempt to outrun what lay buried inside me. With the dying light of the afternoon casting long, sinister shadows across the ruined vehicle, I made a quiet vow. I would no longer run from my past. The desert had shown me that escaping was impossible. The echoes of my guilt were woven into the very fabric of this harsh, relentless land. My journey ahead would not be easy. It would mean facing the harsh truths of my own actions, and perhaps in that confrontation finding a path toward redemption. Even now, as I write these words in the sparse light of a makeshift shelter far from where the storm raged, I am left with an unyielding uncertainty. The desert remains, vast and indifferent, a constant reminder that some sins and scars are etched too deeply to be washed away by time or distance. I don't know if I will ever fully repair the damage done to my soul, but for the first time in a long while, I am ready to try. The journey toward redemption is a long, uncertain road, but standing amidst the wreckage of my past, I believe that perhaps I can finally begin to rebuild, not just my life, but my very self. The memory of that brutal encounter, the face of the sentinel, and the relentless fury of the sandstorm will forever haunt me. But maybe, just maybe, in embracing the truth of my actions and the harsh lessons of the desert, I can find a way to heal. The cost of escape was too high. And now, as I step forward into the uncertain twilight, I know that the only path to redemption lies in confronting the demons I once tried so desperately to leave behind. My name is Samantha Collins. I'm 34 years old. This happened in the oppressive silence of the Gila National Forest, New Mexico, where I set out for nothing more than a few quiet days of camping in my RV. I left everything behind: my job as an environmental journalist in the city, the endless noise of my busy life, and my burning need for answers. But I didn't know when I parked by a forgotten mining road that this would spiral into something darker than I could have imagined. The trip started with nothing more than a strong cup of coffee, the hum of the RV engine, and the serenity of open desert. My plan was simple: explore, investigate, and gather information on a mining operation that, according to the rumors, had been illegally dumping toxic waste in a nearby canyon. I needed evidence to expose the environmental atrocities that were poisoning the land and its inhabitants. But I wasn't expecting a personal vendetta to rear its head, one tied to the very corporation I aimed to expose for its exploitation of the earth and people. The day was still young when I parked in a remote service station to top off the RV's fuel. It was one of those dusty, half-abandoned places far off the beaten track, the kind of spot locals avoid, but travelers like me wind up at when they're looking for the path less traveled. I stood by the pump refueling when a man in his 50s limped toward me. His thick beard and ragged appearance gave him the look of someone who had long since abandoned polite society for something quieter and smarter. "You look like you're heading to Gila," he said, his voice gravelly. I nodded cautiously. "Just passing through, a research trip." He chewed on the side of his cheek before continuing. "You looking for trouble out there?" I didn't quite know how to respond. "I'm just investigating a mining operation, nothing much, but I heard rumors about old dumping sites, had to check it out." The man stopped fiddling with his jacket zipper, his eyes narrowing. "Rumors? Sure." His eyes flickered away, scanning the horizon like one who had seen too many things they wished they hadn't. "The land remembers. Best not mess too much with what's buried," he muttered, walking away. Something about his words didn't sit right with me, but I ignored it and finished fueling, shaking off the unease that seemed to cling to him like a second skin. By the time I found my campsite near abandoned mining equipment, the mood within me shifted from cautious optimism to something darker. I found what I thought was a dry creek bed, long neglected by any tourist. But near the edge, I noticed discarded miners' tools, some rusting, others faded by the weight of time. The wind had a way of kicking up dust and debris every time I walked the perimeter of the site. Under one of the nearby rocks, there were stray pieces of clothing. A tatter of red fabric here, an old boot there, but no other signs of life. It felt wrong, unsettling even. That night, exhaustion weighed heavy on me. There had been no signs of any new mining activity, just ancient scars left in the land. But as I lay in bed with the soft scratching of desert wind echoing around the RV, I realized something had changed. The usual hum of the desert had quieted to an unnatural silence. The lights flickered on the dashboard just for a second, and that tight knot of dread inside me began twisting. I told myself it was just the isolation getting to me. Maybe I'd missed the mark. Maybe the rumors weren't true. But I was still certain something foul was happening out here. And when I found that strange, large piece of machinery tucked deep in the canyon, I knew I was about to uncover something much bigger. But nothing could have prepared me for the truth. The situation escalated quickly. By the second day after my arrival, unexplained electrical glitches started popping up in my RV. I couldn't get a clear read from my GPS. Whether it was tampered with or simply outdated, I couldn't tell. But I felt increasingly stranded. As I wandered deeper into the waste dump site, I found piles of metallic debris, old water barrels labeled with toxic warnings, and a ravaged patch of ground that reeked of a chemical burn. That's when I saw the most chilling thing yet. Fresh blood. Not a lot, just faint traces leading from the bushes near the canyon's edge. I don't know what alerted me, maybe the smell, maybe the hairs on the back of my neck standing straight up, but I followed the trail, too terrified to look back. And that's when I saw it. 2 bodies, motionless, staring now in the bright midday sun. They were young people, their hands tied. Their eyes were wide open with terror, but there was no breath in their chests. Nausea hit me instantly. I turned quickly, rushing back to the RV. The man from the service station had lied. The land was buried in more than just corporate waste. I was about to confirm it with my investigation when, suddenly, the RV door shuddered. I froze. The wind picked up again, stronger this time, but it was no breeze. This felt wrong. My heart pounded faster as I hurried to lock the doors. Before I could make sense of things, the flashing of lights blinded me inside the RV. Bam! The sound of a knock at the door, muffled beneath the relentless gusts. I tried to ignore it, but whoever it was outside wasn't letting up. Then the voice came, in a smooth whisper. "You've dug too deep, haven't you?" I knew then. They were coming for me. The same people that had connected themselves to the corporation's dark underbelly. Terror ran so deep it made my skin crawl. I opened the door to find two masked strangers, standing still as statues. My instinct was instinctive and I slammed the door shut, just too late. They yanked at the handles. Through the cracks in the doorframe I saw their eyes, deep pools of nothing. I rushed to the window for an escape route, but it was no use. They were closing in. With no choice left, I grabbed the valuables. Notes, camera gear, I ran. I didn't know where to go, not exactly, but I just had to get away. The figures behind me followed, laughing, their footsteps in sync, like an ominous prelude to something worse. The sun began blistering overhead as I ran into the heart of the canyon. Around the corner, I saw him. The drifter. It hit me all at once. He wasn't just a harmless, wandering fool. He was part of this, leading me straight into the trap. "Stop running," he said. His voice sent a chill right through me. I didn't stop. I ran faster, fighting the fear that slowed me down. The roar of feet behind me escalated as the chase continued through the rocks until one of them reached me. I was caught. I woke to searing pain in my chest, feeling cold concrete against my skin. For days, I endured the torture of not knowing who my captors were or the extent of their operation. Explanations didn't matter. I couldn't escape. And then, something happened. I saw the land. All of it. The desert's dead silent knowing, to where everything had been buried. And the first thing I noticed was that their symphony of exploitation was only the prelude. Soon, the man I'd trusted finally betrayed me. He led the rest to me. But I can't keep running anymore. I'm going to expose them all, even if it's my last act. The last thing I heard, before the world went silent, was the desert calling again. But now, I don't think it's only pointing toward the truth of the crimes right under our feet. No, I think it's calling me too. Por 19 segundos. My name is Samantha Collins. I'm 34 years old. This happened last summer, deep in the remote expanses of western New Mexico near the fringes of the Gila National Forest. I had spent years watching corporate greed destroy the land and lives in my hometown, and I'd made it my mission to expose the truth. When I received a cryptic tip about illegal toxic waste dumping at a hidden canyon, and whispers that this sordid operation might be connected to human trafficking, I knew I had to investigate. I set out in my aging RV, a battered vehicle that had carried me through countless dusty backroads and endless horizons. The open road was both a promise of freedom and a challenge to my resolve. As I drove deeper into the desolate landscape, the vast, sun-bleached vistas of New Mexico seemed to whisper secrets of their own. But soon, my refuge on wheels began to betray me. The RV's electrical system started acting up. Dashboard lights flickered erratically, the GPS struggled to provide a coherent route, and a low, persistent hum echoed through the cabin. One morning, I discovered hastily scrawled graffiti along the side of the RV, a jagged message that read, "Turn back now." I wasn't sure whether it was a warning from a concerned local or a deliberate attempt to scare me off, but it only deepened my determination to find the truth. I parked the RV near an abandoned mining site that lay like a scar on the desert floor. The area was a haunting tableau. Rusting mining equipment lay strewn about, and the ground was littered with discarded items. A child's toy, a torn jacket, empty water bottles, all relics of lives once intertwined with this forsaken place. Even more unsettling were the faint traces of blood I noticed in the disturbed soil, quickly smoothed over by the relentless desert winds. Every detail confirmed that something terrible had happened here. My investigation took a turn when I stopped for fuel at a lonely service station on the outskirts of a crumbling town. There, I met Hector, a local man with deeply lined features and eyes that seemed to carry the weight of too many secrets. Over a cup of lukewarm coffee in a dim, cramped booth, he offered me insider tips about the mining operation. His words were measured and cautious. "There's more to this dump than you might think," he said quietly, glancing around as if the very walls had ears. "They cover up everything, even the worst of crimes." Though his tone was laced with warning, something about his furtive pauses and evasive answers set off alarms in my mind. Nonetheless, I trusted him. For now. Back at the RV, I began piecing together my findings. I'd taken countless photos, gathered samples, and scribbled notes on everything from the malfunctioning equipment to the strange graffiti. Late that evening, while I was poring over my evidence by the glow of a single lantern, the RV shuddered violently. Before I could react, the sound of shattering glass and heavy, deliberate pounding shattered the fragile silence. Masked figures stormed the vehicle. I barely had time to scramble for my camera and notepad before a rough hand clamped over my mouth, and I was dragged out into the night. I woke sometime later in a dank, claustrophobic space that reeked of oil and decay, a makeshift cell in what looked like an old mining facility repurposed into a holding area. My wrists were bound, and every surface around me bore scars of rust and neglect. The realization hit me with a crushing weight. I had been captured by the very criminals I had been investigating. Their eyes, cold and unyielding, followed my every movement as they subjected me to a brutal interrogation. Hours blurred together in a haze of physical pain and psychological torment. They demanded to know what I had discovered, interspersing my own recorded interviews with doctored evidence meant to confuse and terrify me. Every insult, every lash, was designed to silence me, to erase any trace of the truth I was determined to expose. The betrayal stung the deepest. In the midst of this torment, I learned that Hector, the man I had trusted, was not a concerned local at all. He was an informant for the criminal network behind the toxic dumping and trafficking. His guidance had been a ruse to lure me into their clutches. The shock of that betrayal cut through me like a blade. I felt utterly isolated, abandoned by even the few I thought might help. For what felt like an eternity, I languished in that cell, every moment a struggle against despair. Yet, amid the darkness, a spark of resolve refused to be extinguished. One day, while the guards were momentarily distracted, I noticed that a loose piece of metal from a corroded fixture had freed the binding on one of my wrists. With painstaking effort, I wriggled my hand free and managed to retrieve a small tool from the debris. The opportunity came suddenly. A lone guard left his post to answer a distant call. I mustered every ounce of strength and stealthily overpowered him, seizing his keys. Heart pounding, I crept through the labyrinthine corridors of the facility, every step fraught with the possibility of discovery. Bursting out into the cool night air, I found myself in a stark, moonlit desert that offered both freedom and danger. But I clutched the small evidence bag that contained the precious documents, digital recordings, and photographs I had managed to salvage before my capture. With the RV and my former sanctuary far behind me, I ran on foot through rocky canyons and barren plains. the relentless New Mexican sun and biting wind testing my every step. Night brought little relief. It only deepened the sense of impending doom. I sought shelter in a narrow canyon, its towering, jagged walls providing scant cover from the elements. Yet even there, in the relative quiet, I could hear the distant sound of pursuit, a low rumble, the crunch of gravel underfoot, the unmistakable cadence of footsteps closing in. My pulse thundered in my ears as I realized that the criminals were not about to let me disappear without a fight. The next morning, the chase reached a fever pitch. I found myself in a narrow canyon pass, the rocky terrain funneling my pursuers into a deadly ambush. With nowhere left to run, I braced myself for the inevitable confrontation. Masked men armed with menacing weapons emerged from the rocky shadows, their eyes hidden behind dark masks, their intentions unmistakably hostile. In that claustrophobic pass, violence erupted in a cacophony of shouts, clanging metal, and the raw sound of fists meeting flesh. I fought with everything I had, a mixture of desperation and righteous fury, driven by the knowledge that I held evidence that could dismantle a corrupt empire. In the melee, I managed to keep hold of my bag. Every bruise and cut, every moment of searing pain, only fueled my determination. Amid the chaos, I spotted a narrow gap in the enemy's formation. Seizing the opportunity, I broke free from the immediate threat and sprinted down the rugged canyon, my pursuers close behind. My body screamed in protest as I navigated jagged rocks and unstable ground, but I pressed on, fueled by a single-minded need to survive and expose the truth. The desert, relentless and indifferent, tested me at every turn. The scorching heat by day and the bitter cold by night were as unforgiving as the men chasing me. Each step was a struggle, but I clung tightly to the evidence, a lifeline that promised justice if I could only make it out alive. Finally, as exhaustion and adrenaline blurred together, I emerged at the edge of a plateau. There, hidden among the rocky outcrops, was a covert checkpoint manned by a small group of environmental activists and sympathetic law enforcement officers. They had been investigating similar allegations, and in that moment, fate had delivered me into their care. Collapsing into their arms, battered and bleeding, I handed over the damning evidence. Their faces, filled with concern and resolve, assured me that my ordeal had not been in vain. They promised that the documents, recordings, and photographs would spark a full-scale investigation into the corrupt mining operation and its ties to human trafficking. In the days that followed, news of the scandal broke wide open. The corrupt corporation, once a faceless monolith of corporate greed, was exposed for its environmental crimes and inhumane practices. Law enforcement, buoyed by the new evidence, began dismantling the criminal network piece by piece. Though I would never forget the brutal torture I endured, or the betrayal that cut so deeply, I also recognized that my suffering had contributed to a greater good, a victory for environmental justice and human decency. Now, as I sit in a modest safe house far from the unforgiving desert, I find solace in the knowledge that the truth has been unearthed. The desert, with its stark beauty and hidden dangers, remains a reminder of the fragile balance between nature and human greed. It taught me that even in the harshest, most desolate landscapes, the fight for justice is both a battle against external corruption and an internal struggle against isolation and despair. I still think about Hector with a mixture of regret and anger. The sting of betrayal is a wound that never fully heals. Yet, that betrayal has only strengthened my resolve. I know now that true courage lies in facing the darkness, both in the world around us and in the depths of our own hearts. My RV, once a symbol of freedom and exploration, now lies in ruins, a monument to the cost of truth in a world where corruption is as pervasive as the shifting sands of the desert. As I prepare to return to the field, I carry with me not just the scars of my ordeal, but also a renewed determination to fight for those who cannot fight for themselves. The journey was harrowing, and the price of truth was steep, but I believe that every sacrifice is a step toward a more just world. The desert may be vast and indifferent, but it is also a place where the echoes of our struggles resonate, reminding us that even in the midst of despair, the human spirit can prevail. And so, with the evidence secured and a newfound strength burning in my heart, I step forward into an uncertain future. I know there will be more battles, more betrayals, and more moments when the darkness seems too overwhelming. But I also know that every step I take, every truth I expose, is a victory against the forces that seek to destroy our world. The road ahead is long, and the scars I bear are a constant reminder of what I've endured. Yet, in that pain lies the hope of redemption, a hope that even the harshest desert can bloom with the promise of justice. My name is Alice Monroe. I'm 35 years old. This happened during what was supposed to be an adventurous RV road trip into the rugged backwoods of Mesquite Mesa near Silver City, New Mexico. A journey intended to uncover the truth behind local legends of a shape-shifting terror known as El Caminante. I had always been drawn to the unknown. As a former investigative journalist, I craved a story that would challenge both my skills and my resolve. I wasn't alone in this pursuit. With me were my close friends. Brian Torres, whose artistic soul and secret fascination with the occult sometimes led him down dangerous paths. Carlos Ramirez, a fiery, no-nonsense skeptic whose protective nature kept us grounded. And Denise Alvarez, quiet and perceptive, whose intuition about impending doom was almost eerie in its accuracy. Rounding out our small team was Miguel Santos, a local guide with an affable smile and deep knowledge of indigenous lore. His tales of El Caminante, a malevolent, shifting entity said to prey on unwary travelers, both thrilled and unnerved us. We set off in an old, battered RV that I'd managed to fix up just enough for this expedition. The vehicle, however, soon proved to be as unreliable as it was vintage. On the second day, as we navigated a narrow, dusty trail, the GPS began glitching, the engine sputtered, and eventually the RV ground to a halt. Stranded in a vast, unforgiving desert, we were forced to continue on foot. That first night in the desert was heavy with foreboding. The silence was unnerving, punctuated only by the sound of our own uneasy footsteps on cracked earth. As darkness fell, I began noticing strange tracks near our makeshift campsite, tracks that appeared too large, too deliberate, as if something had been stalking us. Denise, ever the keen observer, pointed out ritualistic symbols crudely etched into the rock faces nearby. They bore a resemblance to the markings in the local legends Miguel had mentioned, a sign, he had warned, that ancient rites might be at work. Our nerves were fraying. Over a small campfire, heated debates broke out. Carlos, with his practical, unwavering demeanor, dismissed the signs as nothing more than natural wear and tear on the rock. Brian, however, seemed increasingly agitated by what he called the whisper of ancient secrets. I tried to keep us focused on the facts, but even I couldn't ignore the palpable dread that crept up our spines as night deepened. Miguel's demeanor grew odd, too. Earlier, he had regaled us with stories of El Caminante, a shape-shifting creature, part human, part demon, that could lure its victims away from safety with haunting calls and deceptive appearances. His tone was ambiguous, a mix of warning and reluctant pride. I sensed that there was something more in his words, something he wasn't telling us. The next morning, with the RV still dead in the desert, we set off on foot. The relentless sun beat down on us as we trudged along dusty paths, our supplies dwindling and our spirits waning. The isolation magnified every sound, every whisper of wind. It wasn't long before the first real sign of trouble emerged. In the distance, silhouettes moved with unnerving coordination. Before we could react, we were ambushed by shadowy figures emerging from behind the rock formations. In the chaos that ensued, fear turned into raw panic. I barely registered the screams and shouts over the howling wind. Amid the turmoil, I caught sight of Miguel, his friendly facade gone, smirking as he led us deeper into a trap. His eyes held a secret malice that I had never seen before. In that moment, I realized he wasn't just our guide. He was complicit with the cult that worshipped El Caminante, a cult rumored to indulge in unspeakable acts to summon and honor the creature. The ambush escalated rapidly. Masked figures, their faces obscured by crude fabric and ritual paint, overpowered us. In the fray, Denise was ripped away from our group. I remember her pleading as she was dragged into the darkness, her cries swallowed by the desert wind. The cultists' torches flickered ominously, illuminating twisted symbols and the contorted expressions of their zealotry. I fought desperately to reach her, but chaos reigned. In the confusion, it became painfully clear that Brian, the quiet dreamer among us, had been in secret contact with these cultists. His betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound. I recall him whispering words of forbidden lore, his eyes gleaming with a mixture of awe and terror as he signaled the attackers. His treachery left me reeling, the sense of isolation and vulnerability intensified by the fact that one of our own had willingly turned traitor. Desperation and guilt propelled me forward. Alongside Carlos, whose fierce determination still burned despite the odds, we rallied to rescue Denise. We tracked her cries to a crude altar set up in a shallow, rocky outcrop. A fierce desert storm began to roll in, whipping the sand into a frenzy, as if nature itself was screaming in protest. The cultists, emboldened by their dark rites, began a brutal ceremony intended to invoke the full power of El Caminante. I witnessed horrors that seared themselves into my memory. Denise was bound to a stone slab, her eyes wide with terror as the cultists subjected her to relentless, sadistic rituals. The air grew thick with the stench of burning herbs and blood. As I and Carlos crept closer, a deep, otherworldly growl echoed across the dunes, a sound that defied human explanation. The creature itself had made its presence known. El Caminante emerged from the swirling sand, a shifting, demonic silhouette that defied logic. Its form was ever-changing, at one moment appearing as a gaunt, tormented man, and at the next, a hideous beast with contorted limbs and malevolent eyes. The creature exuded a cold, oppressive aura that seemed to drain the very hope from our souls. Even the raging storm seemed to bow before its unnatural power. Carlos, ever the skeptic, confronted the creature head-on. In a moment of reckless bravery, he charged forward, determined to put an end to the cult's twisted ritual. But the encounter quickly turned violent. Caught in the grip of the creature's supernatural influence, Carlos was subjected to unspeakable torture. I watched in helpless horror as he was overpowered, his shouts muffled by the roar of the storm, his pleas for mercy drowned out by the chaotic symphony of violence. I still hear the echo of his final cry, a sound of agony and betrayal that will haunt me forever. In the midst of this maelstrom of terror, I managed to break through the circle of cultists. Fueled by a desperate need to save Denise and avenge Carlos, I wrenched her from her bindings. The pain of her ordeal was etched into every bruise and tear, but even as we fled, the weight of our loss pressed down on me. The betrayal by Brian was the final blow. Overwhelmed by guilt and the realization of his complicity, he attempted to flee, but in the ensuing struggle, he was caught by the cultists. His fate was sealed in a moment of brutal retribution. His body was found later, a testament to the savage justice of the cult. His death, combined with Carlos's loss and Denise's suffering, left me questioning whether any of us would ever truly escape this nightmare. In the chaotic aftermath, Denise and I managed to stagger away into the unforgiving desert. Every step was a battle against despair, and the overwhelming sense that we had been marked by something beyond human comprehension. The cult's chants, the distant howls of El Caminante, and the echoes of our own fractured voices haunted the barren landscape. Even as we finally reached a narrow, rocky pass where rescue seemed possible, the curse of that night lingered like a malignant shadow. The oppressive heat of the New Mexican sun did little to dispel the chill that had seeped into our bones. With every passing moment, I was haunted by the fear that the evil we had encountered was not confined to that isolated desert. It was part of the land, woven into the very fabric of Mesquite Mesa, waiting patiently for the next unsuspecting soul to cross its path. Now, as I write these words in the relative safety of a small motel far from the scene of our nightmare, the memories are as vivid as if they happened only moments ago. Denise remains silent most of the time, her eyes distant and haunted, as if she's forever trapped in that moment of unspeakable terror. I try to make sense of it all. The broken RV, the betrayal, the inexplicable power of El Caminante. But some questions remain unanswered, and some horrors, I fear, will never truly fade. I know that in this vast, unforgiving desert, survival comes at an unrelenting cost. The scars on our bodies and the shattered remnants of our trust are a constant reminder that the boundaries between the natural and the supernatural are perilously thin. Even now, when the night falls and the wind carries whispers of ancient rituals, I can't help but wonder if the evil we encountered will one day return to claim what it believes is its due. There is no closure in this tale, only an ongoing battle against forces that defy explanation, and a haunting certainty that some terrors are best left undisturbed. As I stare out at the endless horizon, I know that the curse of El Caminante is far from broken. And somewhere in the vast, empty desert, I sense that our ordeal is merely the beginning of a darker story yet to unfold. My name is Eli Ramirez. I'm 37. This happened at El Morro National Monument in New Mexico, a place of rugged canyons, ancient inscriptions, and a silence so deep it almost spoke. I set out in my battered RV, determined to unravel the mystery of my sister's disappearance years ago, a mystery that had gnawed at me since I'd last seen her on an RV trip much like this one. As a former journalist, I'd spent my life chasing stories, but nothing had prepared me for the ghosts of my own past. The RV was a relic, a sputtering, temperamental machine that had seen better days. From the moment I hit the remote, unpaved roads, it became clear that the journey itself was fraught with challenges. The engine coughed and stuttered, and every so often the radio would fill with static and fragmented voices that sounded eerily like whispers on the wind. I dismissed it as faulty wiring and the natural quirks of old equipment, but deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. After hours of driving, the landscape opened up into a vast canyon dotted with ancient petroglyphs. The rocks, scarred by time and weather, seemed to tell silent stories of those who had passed before. I parked near one of these formations, setting up camp in the fading light. That first night was quiet, save for the howling wind and the occasional groan of the RV's engine. Yet, as darkness deepened, so did the uncanny sensations. I began noticing signs that echoed the very days when my sister vanished. Abandoned campsites with handwritten notes, scattered personal belongings that resembled items she'd cherished, and footprints in the sand that vanished as mysteriously as she had. It wasn't long before I heard a voice, soft and distant, almost a whisper carried by the night air. I paused, heart pounding, straining to decipher the sound. For an agonizing moment, it resembled her gentle call, as if beckoning me to follow. The sound was so faint and fleeting I convinced myself it was a trick of the wind. But then came a string of unsettling graffiti carved into a rock near my RV, a series of symbols, and the words "The Echo." Local legends spoke of a ghostly force by that name, a presence that trapped wandering souls and reenacted the tragedies of the past. The connection was too chilling to ignore. The next morning, while I was checking my supplies, I encountered Samantha Sam Ortega, a no-nonsense local park ranger with a weathered face and eyes that seemed to carry both skepticism and sorrow. She initially regarded my frantic questions about the strange occurrences with polite disbelief. "There's nothing here but the wind and old memories," she said curtly. But as the day wore on, inexplicable events began to unfold around her as well. She admitted that she'd heard soft voices in the canyon at night, and even caught a glimpse of a figure that reminded her of a lost loved one. Reluctantly, she agreed to help me dig into the mystery of the disappearances that haunted these parts. A few days into my solitary investigation, my RV sputtered to a stop on a particularly remote stretch of road. Stranded with no immediate hope of repair, I had no choice but to seek shelter on foot. I found refuge in a shallow alcove beneath a rocky overhang. As I waited for the situation to resolve, I was visited by an odd figure, an old man known locally as Old Hector. His appearance was as cryptic as his speech, his eyes reflecting secrets of the wilderness. "You're digging into matters best left alone, boy," he rasped, his voice low and heavy with warning. "The canyon holds echoes of the past that can swallow a man whole." Before I could press him for details, he vanished as silently as he'd appeared, leaving me with more questions than answers. As night fell once more, I couldn't shake the images of my sister from my mind. I'd grown up with her gentle laughter and kind eyes, and the memory of her sudden disappearance was a constant ache in my heart. In the darkness, my guilt and grief mingled with the oppressive atmosphere of the canyon. I began to experience vivid hallucinations, fleeting glimpses of her standing at the edge of the rocky cliffs, her face pale and sorrowful, silently accusing me for not being there. Whether these visions were figments of my broken mind or something more sinister, I couldn't tell. Then came the night that would change everything. I had been following a trail of cryptic graffiti and unsettling carvings that mimicked the ancient petroglyphs when I stumbled upon a hidden encampment deep within a narrow canyon. My pulse raced as I peered through the darkness, realizing I had discovered a clandestine group, people whose devotion to the local legends bordered on fanaticism. They were gathered in a crude circle, performing a ritual that sent shivers down my spine. In the center of their gathering was an altar adorned with mementos that bore an uncanny resemblance to the items my sister had once owned. The ritual seemed to be a reenactment of the very events leading up to her disappearance, as if they were trying to summon or recapture the moment she was lost. Before I could retreat unnoticed, I was spotted. Shouts erupted from within the encampment, and a violent struggle ensued. I bolted in the opposite direction, heart hammering, as several members of the group pursued me. Their chants filled the narrow canyon, their voices echoing off the ancient walls. In a heart-pounding moment of crisis, just as I was about to be overtaken, Sam appeared at my side. Together, we fought our way through the chaotic melee, our efforts fueled by desperation and the unyielding need to bring the truth to light. The confrontation was brutal. In the dim light, I saw faces twisted with fanaticism, their eyes gleaming with a fervor that defied logic. I dodged and stumbled over rocks as one of them lunged at me with a makeshift weapon. Sam's quick reflexes saved me more than once, and eventually we managed to disrupt the ritual, scattering the cultists into the labyrinthine canyons. In the aftermath of the melee, I collapsed against a rocky wall, the adrenaline slowly ebbing away and leaving me with a profound sense of loss and bewilderment. As I lay there catching my breath, a terrifying realization washed over me. The echoes of my past, of my sister's disappearance and my own failings, might not be entirely supernatural. Amid the chaos, I had begun to see her again, not as a ghostly apparition, but as a projection of my deepest guilt and regret. The lines between reality and hallucination blurred, and I found myself questioning whether the echo was an external force or merely a manifestation of the trauma I'd carried for so long. The following days passed in a haze of uneasy introspection and sporadic encounters with the uncanny. Sam and I continued to piece together fragments of evidence, scraps of notes, personal belongings, and cryptic symbols etched into the canyon walls. Each discovery deepened the mystery rather than resolving it. Despite our efforts, the truth behind my sister's fate remained maddeningly elusive. Was she taken by a human cult, or had the spectral force known as the Echo claimed her in a twist of tragic destiny? The evidence was as fragmented as my memories. In the quiet moments after our violent confrontation, I began to understand that some mysteries might be beyond human comprehension. The canyon held secrets that could twist a man's mind, and perhaps the real horror was not in the supernatural elements at all, but in the darkness of human obsession and the guilt that can fester over time. I realized that my relentless pursuit of the past had been both a quest for truth and an act of self-punishment. The memory of my sister, as painful as it was, had driven me to the edge of sanity. Eventually, Sam and I parted ways. She returned to her duties as a park ranger, her eyes shadowed by what she had witnessed, while I remained in my battered RV, now a reluctant custodian of a truth that was both unresolved and unsettling. I spent long, sleepless nights driving the winding canyon roads, haunted by unanswered questions and the persistent, ghostly whispers of the canyon. Every gust of wind seemed to carry fragments of a voice that could have been my sister's, or perhaps just the collective sorrow of countless lost souls. As I drove away from El Morro, the landscape receding in the rearview mirror, I was left with a profound sense of ambiguity. I had found no definitive answers, only fragments of evidence and a lingering, oppressive uncertainty. The canyon's secrets remained intact, waiting for the next lost soul to wander its paths. And I, forever changed by the journey, carried with me the echoes of that night. The violent struggle, the cryptic warnings of old Hector, the fierce determination of Sam, and above all, the haunting possibility that the real horror lay not in the supernatural legend of the Echo, but in the dark corners of the human heart. In the end, I could only hope that my relentless quest, as painful as it was, might someday lead to a measure of closure. Until then, every mile I traveled was a reminder that some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved, and that the past, with all its ghosts and regrets, can never truly be left behind. The desert had a way of etching its mark on you, and as I continued down the forgotten road, I couldn't help but feel that its secrets would forever whisper in the recesses of my mind, haunting every step I took.